Hello and welcome to Purely Academic, your potentially educational podcast. This is our topic episode for July 2026. I'm Dr. Jonathan Lack, Lord of Lies. I write about movies, I teach cinema studies at the University of Colorado, and I'm practicing for an archery contest at this rich widow's house tomorrow. I think it's going to go really well for me.
And I'm Sean Chapman, the man skilled in all ways of contending. I'm a high school English teacher by day, otaku by night, and I definitely have not been procrastinating for the past 7 years because I'd much rather spend my time sleeping with a literal goddess in a literal paradise. It's like, I'll go home eventually. I swear, I'll get there. I promise. It's just, I got some shit going on right now.
Yeah, in the original poem, Odysseus conspicuously does not tell Penelope everything that happened, and that's probably for the best, because I think there's some things she would not have been cool with.
Yeah, he's like, and then there was that one beautiful goddess, Circe, or Kirke, and I was on her island for a bit, doing stuff, and then I was with another beautiful goddess, Calypso, and then I was on her island for, a bit longer, and we did some stuff too. I'm not going to say what, but, I was there.
All right, if you can't tell, we are talking about the Odyssey today. Obviously, it is the topic of the moment because Christopher Nolan has released his 2026 adaptation of the film starring Matt Damon, and it is a massive, massive hit. Who'da thunk it? Chris Nolan made a hit.
What? People went to the movie theater to see the Christopher Nolan movie? Never. It's never happened before.
And so we're going to talk about the movie. We're also going to, because this is purely academic, we're going to have a little book club, and we're going to talk about the original Odyssey. Well, not the original, because neither of us can read Greek, but we're going to talk about the poem we're specifically for this one, we read the 2017 translation by Emily Wilson, which has been very popular and was inspirational to Nolan and sort of the cast and crew of this latest movie. But of course, I've read at least one other translation. I know you've read many of them.
I've read 3 translations. I've done Fagles, which I know we both did Fagles because that was what we did at high school. And then I did Fitzgerald in college, and then I had not done the Wilson translation yet, and so this was my first time reading that one.
Yeah, and this was my second time through on that one, and I love the Wilson translation. And obviously the Odyssey is just a really cool story, and it's a story that has survived for 3,000 some years for good reason, and continues to be interpreted and reinterpreted, and that is a cool thing. So, obviously you and I both like the poem. I don't think we should do, what's our hot take on the Odyssey, the poem. As for the movie, I run, and I think this is true of both of us, Sean, a little hot and cold on Christopher Nolan. I often find myself respecting, I respect his, talent as a filmmaker immensely. He's clearly very good at what he does. Sometimes I really respond to his work, sometimes I don't. I was very divided on Oppenheimer, for instance, his movie from 3 years ago. This is the most I've, unabashedly liked one of his films in quite a long time. I think it's his best film other than Interstellar. I really loved it. I think it's it's a much more faithful, take on the Odyssey than I thought you would kind of ever get from Hollywood, doing stuff like the Telemachy part of the story and all of that. But I also think it's a very engaged adaptation that is trying to say something with the text in the modern world, and I like that a lot. And it is also just a, kind of mind-bending spectacle on the level of production and all of that stuff. So I quite enjoyed the film.
I think I'm a bit more mixed on it than you, because I think I'm less hot and cold on Nolan, and I'm more cold on Nolan.
Okay.
This is the most recent Christopher Nolan movie I'd seen before this is actually the Dream one that I'm just probably the name
Inception?
Inception. Yes, I've not.
No, you've seen. Yeah, you have. You've seen The Dark Knight Rises. That's after
okay.
Inception.
So Inception and then The Dark Knight Rises. So sorry, no, The Dark Knight Rises then would be the most recent one I'd seen because I've not seen Interstellar, Oppenheimer, Tenet. Dunkirk. Nope.
Okay. Because you've missed a lot of his career.
Yes, because I don't really like his movies all that much. I think was just a thing where I don't see a lot of modern movies. Now, I think that this film is a good film, certainly. I don't think it's bad. It's more, I have a little bit of a hard time letting go of certain things from the original poem. And I think I've gotten a little bit warmed up on it a little bit after viewing where there's just some choices they made. But I think I still have a fundamental problem with kind of the tone of his films that has always kind of bugged me, and that's very much still here. And that's just a kind of a Christopher Nolan thing of the kind of slightly cold feel that a lot of his movies have to me, I think is still very present here in this film. But as a production, it's really phenomenal. And as an adaptation in general, I think it's really good, even if it's not quite like what speaks to me about the Odyssey doesn't clearly speak to Nolan, and he takes a very different kind of tack with it as what I would personally do. I do think it's a film that is very smart on the level of adaptation in terms of how do you get the bulk of the whole story there in a cinematic format is really expertly done. And it is a movie that is very like conscious about what is it trying to say by using this original text. And I think it does a good job of that. Even if I have some kind of quibbles about specific things here or there. So I do definitely think it's a good movie, but maybe was not a movie that spoke to me personally.
Well, and I think this is an interesting thing to talk about, is the Odyssey is a story that has spoken to almost everyone who's ever lived in the past, like, 3,000 years. And it's spoken differently. And there is no adaptation of the Odyssey that can do all of it, that can capture, if you're going to capture certain things from it, you're going to miss other things from it, particularly in a movie where you have 3 hours. Yeah. But even if you were to do like a mini series where maybe you could go beat by beat, you wouldn't have the budget to do what Nolan is doing, and you wouldn't have like the Cyclops scene being as crazy as it is and stuff like that. So, I think, I'm personally, like, my number one thing is whenever I go to an adaptation, particularly of a text like this, it's like, does the filmmaker have a point of view that is informing what they are pulling out of the text? And I don't even always need to like the point of view to at least respect, like, okay, you made an attempt. Like, that's the number one thing, because I know I've seen shitty adaptations of the Odyssey, usually in school or something, that just are like hitting the beats of the stuff that people know from pop culture osmosis with it. And that's the worst way to do this story. And if you're actually taking it to say something with it, and I think in a way that is deeply felt, that's interesting. And I would also say, as someone who has seen all of Nolan's movies and does find him interesting, I do think this movie is a pretty significant evolution for him stylistically and emotionally, and if you've seen all of his stuff, like, it's actually pretty notable. I think this is the biggest divergence he's made as a filmmaker since The Dark Knight almost 20 years ago, and I think that's cool, because he's someone who could be coasting if he wanted to. He could be coasting very easily if he wanted to, and he's not, and I think that's a good thing for everybody.
Yeah, again, I think it's definitely a movie I respect, because I do think on like a production level, it's really, really quite phenomenal. There are specific quibbles I have, like I think the dialogue in places can be pretty kind of thudding and some things like that. But generally speaking, it is a very, very well-made film.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Sean, how do you want to take this? Do you want to talk about, I guess we could talk about just, you have a deeper relationship with this as someone who studied English in college, and is more, obviously you are a teacher of English and of literature and those sorts of things. So I know I've had more of a casual relationship with this text as someone who's read it more just for fun, but I thought, maybe you could kick us off here by taking us into the world of the story.
Yeah, just to speak to like my relationship to it, because it is one of my favorite books ever. I mean, we did our like top 10 books podcast for the weekly stuff. What is probably like forever ago. That's probably like 7 or 8 years ago.
I believe that was episode 350 or 400. It's one of those milestones. And I remember that section on the Odyssey that you did was so good, and it got me so, because you were so enthusiastic about it, it got me jazzed about it. And I was like seeking out translations, and you mentioned you'd heard about at that time the Emily Wilson translation, which is almost 10 years old, was new at the time. And I mean, in the world of translations, it's still new because these things last for decades. But it made me go buy it, and I read it, and that's when I first read the Wilson translation, was just out of kind of your enthusiasm for it, made me want to read it again, because I hadn't read it since high school, and if you've only read a book in high school, you've never actually read the book, because it's a different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's just a story I've always loved, because I've always also just been into Greek mythology. So it's like, it well predates like reading the original Odyssey in 9th grade English. But just like growing up with Greek mythology and reading those books. And of course, I loved like the Ray Harryhausen movies. So like watching Jason and the Argonauts and stuff like that as a kid. So I've just always really, really loved Greek mythology. And then when I went to Boulder, I took a class on classical literature, to the capital C classical, which means ancient Greek and Roman. And we did the Odyssey there. That is where I've developed this very difficult habit of, I have a hard time with the pronunciations of characters, because that teacher who could read ancient Greek, it was a very cool experience of sometimes asking questions, and she'd be like, you know what, I don't quite know. Let me look at the original. I'll get back to you next class. And it's like, that's a badass thing for a professor to be able to do. Is like, Let me go look at the original Greek text at home, and next time we'll discuss what I found. It was one of my favorite classes I took at Boulder. a great professor. But that professor used the Fitzgerald translation, which is a fantastic translation, a little bit older now, but it also uses like the traditional Greek pronunciations of things. So it is Kirke instead of Circe. It's Cyclops or Cyclopes instead of Cyclops, because there's no soft C in ancient Greek. And so that's where, if people wonder, like, why do I sometimes say Kirke and why do I sometimes say Circe, is because I've been fighting with that since I took that class. I just don't know which pronunciation to use sometimes.
And it's not like there's a right or wrong necessarily. Like,
yeah, exactly.
you know, Emily Wilson, I've heard, obviously she's an expert in it, and she just says Circe, you know, so it depends. It's not like the movie was uneducated in how it pronounced it.
No, yes. It's a personal difficulty I have because of that weird, you know, connection. But the Fitzgerald translation, I think, is great. It's really fantastic. And I've read the Fitzgerald translation multiple times. When I taught in Colorado, teaching English, ninth grade English, I did teach sections of the Odyssey the 2 years I taught in Colorado, because that was a standard thing they did. Didn't do the whole thing because I wasn't teaching honors, just regular English, and the Odyssey is a very big text, and that is not something that a bunch of like 14-year-olds who do not give a shit about English literature, anything, because they're just in their standard English class, are not going to do. So we just did the books 9 through 12, which is all the exciting stuff with the Cyclops and Scylla and Charybdis and all that kind of stuff. And so I did that, taught those 2 years with the Odyssey. And yeah, the Emily Wilson translation that I read for this one is one I've always been interested in and just never had like an excuse or a reason to specifically seek it out to read it. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, was I wanted to be able to read this new translation. Just to get us into the world of the Odyssey a little bit, I do think it's interesting just to talk a little bit about the kind of the context around it, especially because when we get into talking about Nolan's movie, there are things he pulls from outside of the Odyssey itself that kind of inform some of what the movie is talking about. So I did not write to a whole like formalized notes section for this. So this is off the cuff, because trying to actually write it down intimidated the shit out of me. I'm like, I'll just talk about it. So the Odyssey, it was composed sometime 8th century-ish BCE. One thing that's difficult about talking about the Odyssey as a historical artifact is that it is, you know, surrounded in supposition, because it is so old. It is one of, if not the earliest existing text from that culture, that we just have a lot of things that we don't know a lot of clear information about. But think sometime around 8th century BCE, you're talking like 400 years before like Plato. Like it's centuries before what most people think of when they think of ancient Greece, which is more around 5th century BCE kind of stuff. It is composed, or attributed to be composed, to a figure known as Homer, who is supposedly a blind poet, who would have sung or spoken the Odyssey as an oral thing. Because ancient Greece had lost the kind of rudimentary writing system it had at the end of the Bronze Age, and it was an oral spoken tradition. And so that's why the Odyssey is composed in the format it is. It is a poem in what we call the epic verse, which is dactylic hexameter, and it is written in such a way, or composed in such a way, for someone to be able to speak it off the cuff, probably similar, like semi-improvised, we believe, based on studying contemporary oral traditions and oral cultures. But it is composed in such a way that there are these kind of like pieces and elements you can fit in, almost like a puzzle, and construct this long, elaborate story out of doing so. And so there are lots and lots of questions around this, of exactly how did this written version of it get passed down to us, and what were the origins of it. There are almost certainly hundreds and hundreds of proto-Odysseys that existed that were spoken orally and never recorded, or perhaps were recorded and lost to history at some point. The Odyssey itself is a very fractal narrative that reflects countless other myths. You know, you have in Hades, Odysseus starts looking around and he sees, oh, there's Heracles, and there's Sisyphus and Tantalus. And if you have like a vague knowledge of Greek mythology and you read through the Odyssey, you see dozens and dozens of other myths in brief reflected in the story, indicating the ways in which this is part of a big living kind of tapestry of narrative and mythology and pseudo-history that existed for that culture. And the Odyssey is just a kind of concrete form of it that ultimately exists, that was written down, was passed down to us. And there are lots of questions about, like, was Homer a real person? If he was, what role did he have? Did he compose the whole thing? Did he just compile it from existing elements? Was he just the person who ultimately wrote it down and recorded it? But for the ancient world, the Odyssey was, and along with its sister text, the Iliad, which told the story of like the last year basically of the Trojan War around the rage of Achilles, they were fundamental pillars of ancient Greek history and culture. The ancient Greeks did not exist in what we consider to be like a nation. It was a disparate group of separate city-states, individual kingdoms, places like Ithaca in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is his own king and his own ruler, that had a shared cultural heritage and a shared language and things like that. They all existed around that Mediterranean area, but they were distinct groups that would fight with each other. Obviously, the Athenians and the Spartans were constantly going at each other and doing countless wars. And the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Homeric texts, formed as one fundamental pillar, particularly when the Persian Empire invaded, to kind of help create this stronger sense of a unified Greek culture. And then that text got passed down through the Romans. It was from the Western European perspective, briefly lost in what we kind of consider to be the quote unquote Dark Ages, and then rediscovered from a Western European perspective in the Renaissance, which is when those texts came back to us, became embedded in modern quote unquote Western European culture. I'm putting those in quotes because it's all very complicated. I don't want to get into, but this is the basic form of the story. And then that, of course, gets passed down when it's brought to America and becomes kind of established as a fundamental text in America, which is why every American high schooler reads the Odyssey or parts of it at some point. It is just a story that is embedded so deeply in human culture. It has been for thousands of years. And I think there are lots of good reasons for that, and a lot of reasons why it's, I think, a fascinating text to go back to from modern perspective, and why it gets reinterpreted, why it gets retranslated, why it's a story that not only has numerous adaptations in and of itself, but is also sort of loosely adapted, or is clearly a source of profound inspiration for a large number of different stories, like something like The Lord of the Rings has clear elements of the Odyssey in there, particularly the Scouring of the Shire part is completely just the Odyssey. And I think some of the things that the Odyssey hits on that I think is very interesting is one is the foreign nature of the text. It is something that is deeply embedded in an ancient Greek idea of culture and life, and one that presents a very different way of looking at the world and of looking at history, right? Because the Odyssey is composed sometime in the 8th century BCE, but is set sometime in the end of the late Bronze Age, what we call the Mycenaean era, which is a period where there was a series of great powerful civilizations in that Mediterranean area, and all of them eventually kind of fell to ruin. This is part of where, when we talk about the movie, this idea of the quote unquote sea people is sort of pulling on threads of one of the things that is sort of spoken about in history of why these great civilizations fell were attacks from this group of mysterious quote unquote sea people. But the Odyssey as a text reflects this sort of view of history that is indelibly linked in with mythology and these kind of other elements of culture. That's just not how like modern people really look at the world, which I think is very fascinating. And then the structure of the text is so rich and so complex and speaks to so many different elements. The interwoven nature of the narrative of it, starting with these books about Telemachus and him sort of going on his own story, shifting to this complex eventual flashback structure when we shift the viewpoint to Odysseus and getting the nature of his whole journey, where we get the most famous episodes from the story, and then his ultimate homecoming and his slaughtering, the brutal slaughtering of the suitors in his own home. That is just such a richly complicated text that I think it tells you so much about humanity to imagine this thing being composed primarily orally thousands of years ago. Shows just, I think, like the power of human imagination in a really palpable way, and that the text is still, through the cultural lens, is still so alive even when you read it today. And those are some of the things that I think really kind of speaks to me about the Odyssey, is its enduring legacy. I think connects to something kind of very fundamental about human nature, while also being very instructive about the things that are both kind of, I think, eternal about humanity, and the things that are temporary, that change with time, the specific lenses of specific cultures that have specific conditions that create these complex rules of hospitality and things like that the Odyssey is deeply interested in, that are so foreign and alien to us. And it's just this beautiful blending of all those different elements into one long, complex text.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, Sean. That's really always love hearing you talk about this stuff because this is when you get to bring a different kind of expertise than we get when we're talking about like video games or anime or stuff.
Yeah.
Because that's different. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I think my history with the text is more common for Americans, which is I was made to read it in high school. Although today it sounds like no one actually reads books in high school, and it's all excerpts from.
Yeah, you went to Chat GPT and then you add to it's like, what did it say in book 9 of the Odyssey, which is the one that they're trying to make you read because it's the one that's going to be in the state mandated test.
I know.
It's shit.
Anyway, but we had a really cool English teacher in high school, and we read the Fagles translation, which I think, like, at the time at least, that was the one most commonly used in high schools and stuff. That's the one that starts with "Sing to me of the man muse, the man of twists and turns." I do love that first line. Other parts of that translation, I think it gets a little too much into the like faux archaic language and stuff like that, and can be a little stunted in that way. I will say for my part, Sean, coming back to the Odyssey about whenever we did that episode on books and I first read the Wilson translation, I was stunned by it as an adult. Coming back to it now in my 30s, really, I think it's something that grows with you as you age, because I think the thing that always stuns me when I go back to it is that obviously in modern cultural parlance, the word Odyssey is a shorthand for a great journey. That's what we mean when we say you go on an Odyssey, right? And the things that are remembered in cultural shorthand are the events in the 4 books in the middle. It's 1/6 of the text that is Odysseus's flashback about the Cyclops and the Lystragonians and Circe and all of that stuff, right? And that's the stuff that, like, if you're going to parody the Odyssey, that's what you jump to. If you're going to do a basic movie adaptation, that's probably what you're going to fill it with, all of that stuff. But for the most part, the Odyssey is not actually about any of that. I think the funniest one is that the sirens, which is like one of the most enduring images in all of world culture, is like a couple of lines in the text. It's a very, very short piece of that book. And overall, the Odyssey is not about a journey, it's about a homecoming. He gets back to Ithaca almost exactly halfway through. The last 12 books are back on Ithaca. And it is so much more concerned with being in a world that is in some way out of sorts because maybe, for Telemachus, the father is missing, for Ithaca, the king is missing, and for Odysseus, he is not home. And how you put that home back together, and ultimately how that home is not put back togetherable, because the ending of the Odyssey is another, obviously, inspiration on Lord of the Rings, is that in the Odyssey, you don't actually, in the text, you don't see him set off on his next journey, but it ends with him knowing he cannot actually stay in Ithaca and he's going to have to leave again. And I think there's something in all of that as a teenager, I don't think any teenager is going to get all of that. There's a sadness, there's an existential element about, I think, aging and changing and longing and all of those things, in addition to all of the, cultural and historical stuff you were talking about, Sean, that I think reveals itself with age and is something that really has struck me when I've gone back to the text and has become like the thing I really love in it is, I think, those thematic elements that, if you are someone who has not read it since high school or never read it in full, you really owe yourself to find whatever translation appeals to you and spend some time with it, because I think there's so much here that is not in kind of the mainstream popular culture memory of the Odyssey that is really what I think is appealing about it.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm glad you point that out, because it is very true that people sort of look at the most kind of like what we think of as like the most mythologically coded section where you have all the big crazy monsters and stuff, but you're very right, and it is also how it was thought of by the ancient Greeks, that it is a homecoming story. I forget what the ancient Greek term for it was, but that's how they referred to it, was this word for a homecoming, because it was a genre of story almost for them, of like people coming home. I mean, obviously you have, even in the Odyssey itself, you have a reflected narrative of what we now think of as the Oresteia, but Agamemnon's journey home that ends with him getting, shanked basically by his wife and her lover, Aegisthus, and then his son Orestes having to avenge him. But there's like a series of different narratives about like the warriors going to Troy and coming home and stuff like that. And yeah, it very much is this story about this sort of, I think, like endlessly fascinating central figure of Odysseus, who I think is just such a alive character who has so much complexity to him. It's where, even though it's probably not like on the strict level a particularly quote unquote accurate translation, Wilson's choice to just open that translation of his epithet of calling him a complicated man, I think is a really strong choice, because it is what Odysseus is. He's this man of contradictions, a man who both desperately wants to get home, back to his wife, back to his son, whom he has not seen since he was an infant, but also seemingly cannot help himself from constantly being blockaded by these different things that he seemingly should be able to get around or should be able to leave at some point, and just can't bring himself to do so. And is constantly sort of, battling with his own fundamental nature. A man who is both endlessly clever, but endlessly foolish as well. A man who can come up with the most incredible schemes, but also someone so arrogant that he is constantly sort of foiling his own schemes due to that arrogance. And so that central figure of Odysseus, I think, is one of those things that's so really rich and compelling. And I think you're very much right, speaks to you more and more as you get older. And I think you start to confront your own contradictions as an individual person, that no one person is any single thing, but is a ball of complexities that you are constantly like both amazing and also stopping yourself from being as amazing as you could be. And these sort of constant roadblocks that you encounter in your life, there are things you should be able to overcome, but seemingly can't, or questioning the nature of your own kind of goal of like, what is it that you actually want to achieve? And is it a thing you can ever achieve? And so Odysseus has just sort of lived on in a much broader literary tradition as this figure of the kind of eternal wanderer, always saying he wants to get home and yet never really getting there. It's one of the fun things about reading like classical literature is that Odysseus is used as a symbol for that in things like the Divine Comedy. He's in Dante's Hell because he's an eternal wanderer. There's the great Alfred Lord Tennyson poem Ulysses that also is about like Odysseus after the end of the Odyssey going out on yet another journey because he can't ever really find himself at home. And that sense of this homecoming that can never be fulfilled is just such a provocative idea that I think speaks so eternally, and is one of those central themes that is picked up on in so many different works of literature, films, video games, whatever. That idea of someone going on this quest, and then once they find themselves coming back home, the home is not a place they recognize because they are not the person they were anymore, is just such a beautiful theme that the Odyssey, 2,800 years later, it still is the best text to have done it, I would say.
Well, and I think that's why it's survived. Like, honestly, I think if you're aiming what is the thing that has kept it as a constant across human history for, like, most of what we can identify as, like, teachable human history, I really think it's that more than the Cyclops and the men being turned into pigs. And that's all part of it, right? But I really do think that's what's so powerful. And obviously the whole text is about home and the idea of home. And, like, if you read it with fresh eyes, one of the things you'll notice immediately is how many scenes in the Odyssey are about people being welcomed into someone else's home and pouring libations and having a feast and talking. And I mean, almost the entire text is, because it's obviously oral in tradition, this is part of it, but it's almost all people talking to other people and relating a story. And it is about, I think the question of, like, what is a home is so central to also just the themes of, like, is it okay to kill the suitors in your home? Is it okay for what are they doing by being there? All of these, like obviously the central anxiety of the entire text is the suitors. That is the ultimate bad guy, and it is that of, like, what has the home become? And all of those themes are so, finely rendered, and is what, as an adult, I think really pulls me into it, as fun as, the Cyclops scene is and all of that stuff. It's all those bigger things that I think are the real core of the text.
Yeah, and I definitely think from an ancient Greek perspective in particular, that is one of the sort of most fundamental things of the story is, in the ancient Greek culture, there was this concept of what they called xenia, which comes from the ancient Greek word xenos, which means stranger. This is, if you've seen the Christopher Nolan movie, they refer to it as the law of Zeus, is kind of like how he tries to make that palatable to a modern audience. But the idea of xenia is basically a very formalized and complex set of rules around, or customs around, hospitality, of how do you meet and accept a stranger in your home. Like, what are the customs for that? It's things like when a stranger comes to you, you provide them this hospitality without asking them questions. You do not ask them who they are until after you have provided them a meal, because it is too demanding or too presumptuous upon this guest. It is the exchanging of gifts, which is very essential to that culture of that you bring a gift and you receive different gifts. You then become these sort of like, I don't remember exactly what the word is for this, but it's often like sort of translated as a quote unquote stranger friend, but a bond built through two people who have made this connection through a transaction of Xenia, and thus have this sort of relationship. And this thing you see in different myths, there's an encounter in the Iliad between two heroes that they basically decide to stop fighting because they realize that their individual grandfathers, like 80 years ago or whatever it was, had an encounter like this where one of them came to the other as a stranger, received this hospitality, was given hospitality in return. And there's this expectation that if you received Xenia, if you received this level of hospitality, the expectation is that you also give it. This is an essential idea to the ancient Greeks because you got to keep in mind that these are a seafaring people. They all live around the ocean. If they're going to conduct trade, they all have to go far from home across the sea on their ships, or even obviously if you're going across land. And there's no like hotels. This is a culture that doesn't have like currency. It doesn't have money. It's still all through trading. And so this exchange of Xenia is the only way one can travel from home and expect any level of safety. And so it's this fundamental idea of hospitality that is like the recurring theme in the Odyssey, of that it is always about people visiting households and either receiving the proper Xenia. This is like part of the point of the Telemachus' journey in the first 4 books, is it is a proper example of a bright young man going out into the world and going to these great people and showing a good example of this is what this should be like. Like, this is how the host should be behaving. This is how Telemachus should be behaving. And this proper exchange of these relationships shows that he is like a forthright young man that we can kind of put our hopes in for the future. And then Odysseus shows this other version of where he both sort of violates rules of Xenia on his journey, but he also encounters these monstrous versions of them with the Cyclops, with Circe, things like that. And then, of course, he comes home to one of the more complicated examples of it, which is the suitors who have been violating this horrifically by consuming all of Odysseus's wealth, basically at his home, courting his wife, being a piece of shit to his son, all that kind of stuff. But then Odysseus also takes this kind of insane step of killing off what is 100 people. You know, he spares one of the suitors because Telemachus vouches for him, and he spares the guy who's the like bard, basically, who's just happens to be there. Everyone else gets fucking brutally killed, including like most of the female slaves who were, you know, sexually assaulted and or raped by the suitors. He just slaughters all these motherfuckers, you know, wiping out a whole generation of young men in his village. And, you know, I think there is a very significant question in the original text about, is that a thing that he should have done? Because it's pretty fucked up. But this sort of like that the complexities of this relationship of hospitality, of giving and receiving, of finding safety in the world, like is a, you know, I think it's really, it's an interesting theme from our perspective. It is like the most pertinent and important thing in the story from an ancient Greek perspective, where that is like a very living thing. In fact, I don't know this for certain, but I believe that this is not a thing that you would expect from the Mycenaean era, where it's supposed to have been set, which is like several hundred years earlier, the late Bronze Age. But it is, you know, it's them kind of taking this idea and using these ancient characters to tell what is for them a very present contemporary story, reflecting the present contemporary cultural values that are very important.
Oh, so you're saying it's not literal history that we have to very faithfully reproduce as it would have been in its original time? You're saying even when it was written, it was a fiction applied to the contemporary time?
I know what you're getting at, of like the stupid fucking people online.
Stupid online debate.
I do bristle a little bit at using the word fiction applied to the Odyssey, because I don't think that's an appropriate... It's in the same way that I wouldn't use fiction as a word to apply to the Bible, even if like 99% of the things the Bible describes are not
mythology. I don't. Yeah,
it's mythology, right? It's one of the things that's interesting about the Odyssey is that, you know, it is something that, like, you know, I think an ancient Greek audience, wouldn't take 100% of it as being literally actually true. But at the same time, mythos is a thing that it is a sort of like, it's just a different relationship to history of where, I mean, they definitely believed that the Trojan War happened. I think they definitely thought that Achilles and Odysseus and Agamemnon and all those figures are real. And for all we know, they might have been. We have no historical records that tells us the names of any of the people that lived in that time. We know that Troy really existed. We know that Troy is a city that fell multiple times. There probably was some kind of Trojan War-esque conflict. We don't know the nature of any of those things. But it's one of the things I think is interesting about mythology is that it is a way of understanding your own culture and your own history reflected through the lens of storytelling that blends reality and non-reality, which is why I just kind of bristle at the word fiction, because fiction and nonfiction is a modern lens that doesn't really apply to this type of storytelling.
You're totally right, and I wish I had a better single word for this, but I guess what I'm getting at is what you're saying, and I think this is something to keep in mind, is that even at the time this story was first told in the form we recognize it now, it was not attempting to 100% faithfully reproduce history as they knew it to be. It was about the time in which it was told, too, right? That's when you get to, that is why it is completely appropriate for a new movie like the Christopher Nolan movie to have, say, a diverse cast and contemporary accents and things like that.
Should definitely have a diverse cast, because these people weren't all white. We're talking about people living around the Mediterranean area. They were not all just sort of they weren't English people,
Yeah. But my other point is that and this is also the problem, I think, with translations that rely too much on trying to feel archaic in their language. It's not supposed to feel ancient, right? It's supposed to feel present and like something that you can get something from right now. And I think that's something that I think just in culture in general, I'm frustrated with when I think that aspect is flattened, of the purpose of stories is not to freeze them in amber. It's to reproduce and find them in the present. That's part of the invocation to the muse at the beginning of the Odyssey, and different translators relate it differently. This is another place where Wilson makes a little bit of a change to my understanding, is adding the speak to our modern times to the muse, but that is part of it in every translation I've looked at, is some kind of speak to us now, right? And that's very crucial.
Yeah, and these were not stories, traditionally they were not stories set in stone. Eventually they were, not literally stone, but they were written down, and that's how we have them. But again, these, the Odyssey and the Iliad are the fruits of a very, very long period of oral storytelling where those stories evolved as they were told, and would almost certainly would have reflected the individual habits of the individual storyteller. And maybe this guy kind of forgot how this part was supposed to go, but that's fine. You can make it up, because half of the thing is a big formula. Half of it is Athena with her sparkling eyes on Mount Zeus or Mount Olympus. And, you can kind of construct these kind of dactylic hexameter lines pseudo improvisationally to piece the whole story together. And over time, you create a more and more complicated narrative through these tellings and retellings and things like that. And absolutely, it's one of the, again, it is one of the other reasons why fiction is not always the right word to use for mythology, is because mythology is meant to be a living form of narrative. It's something that is meant to evolve and adapt and shift with the telling through the years. It is not something that is meant to be set in stone to reflect a single immovable truth.
Yes, and that's what I'm talking about. You talked earlier about the idea of Xenia, and it's interesting the way Christopher Nolan handles that in the movie is to take the term they use as Zeus's law, and it is both a reflection of that actual original Greek idea of, the stranger could be a god in disguise, all of that stuff, right? But he also pairs it with effectively what is the golden rule, which is a thing in basically every contemporary religion or faith has this, which is treat others how you would be treated. And that is applying, that to our morality systems in a way that is immediate. And I think that's totally appropriate if you're adapting the story and bringing it into modern times. And as you say, that's kind of what they were doing even at the beginning.
Yes, yeah. I do think that there's something about the phrasing the law of Zeus that I found a little bit clunky in the movie. Every time the actor had to say it, I'm like, that feels a little weird. But I like the spirit of the idea of what they're trying to do. They're just trying to find a simple way to communicate this idea very quickly. But yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so do you want to talk about the translation that we looked at, and maybe just since you've read several of them, what you kind of look for or think about in translations of this text?
Yeah, so so we read the Wilson translation specifically for this, and I think whenever whenever a scholar is approaching something like this to do an adaptation or a translation of, there's like, particularly for something like this, where, it is this like super archaic version of the language that, from what I understand, is just kind of crazy. And there's a lot of, ambiguities in the grammar and things like that. Like in the Robert Fitzgerald translation, he has this huge postscript where he just takes you through a bunch of specific scenes where he's like, and here's how like this guy and this guy and this guy translate. And he's just like putting the original ancient Greek letters in there. And he's just like, yeah. So when he says, because I can't read it, maybe he could be meaning this, but it also could be the imperative form of this verb and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, clearly it's a fucking hard thing to translate. And there are lots of questions about how you do it, because in its original form, it's written in this like very strict poetic meter. That is a poetic meter that exists partially for like the nature of the structure of the Greek language. And I do think that Wilson made a lot of really cool and interesting choices that makes her translation very distinctive. But one, and this is, I think, I have to imagine this was a really hardcore thing to do. She kept the line count identical. So her method was to translate it into iambic pentameter, which is, of course, the traditional English language poetry form you'd know from things like Shakespeare, wrote predominantly in iambic pentameter, like, almost all historical English poetry is written in this meter. And so she said, okay, let's take that. Let's keep the kind of verbal energy of it alive by keeping a kind of metrical form, adapt that metrical form for something that works for English. Because it would be crazy to try to do it all in dactylic hexameter in English. It's like, just, I wouldn't. But then making that additional choice of, I'm going to keep the line count the exact same, because translations of the Odyssey, as any translation would, inevitably would inflate the overall length of the text, because you need to use, especially in English, more words to describe things in the translated language than the language that it's coming from, right? And this is particularly for English, which is a very verbal language. It's a language that has a lot of words, more words in it than any other language in the whole history of humanity. And so inevitably the Odyssey ends up becoming more and more inflated in length. Now, I think it is obviously very fine to say, well, let's just make the Odyssey longer in English so we can keep all of the nuance, or try to keep all that nuance in our translation and not worry about the length. But there is also obviously an interesting point to, let's keep the line length the same and try to like retain the pacing of the original text as much as possible and prioritize that. And then the other big thing that Wilson does is use mostly very contemporaneous modern day English, but she also doesn't like sort of try to shave over the kind of oddities of the original text that would come from the Greek language, which I think gives it a really nice blend where it is very easily readable. It's not like you're not struggling to get through it, but also it still has a certain kind of slightly exotic flavor to it because of the nature of like the heroic similes in the original poem can be sometimes strange. And she doesn't try to sort of like shave those down. And so I think it ends up ultimately being a really fun translation that's very readable. It's got a really nice pace to it. It's got a very nice flow to it. And I think that it is definitely the one that, like, if were I to recommend like a layperson just to read the poem for entertainment, not necessarily for like an academic study, absolutely this would be the text to go to because of those things. It's just so light on its feet. It's so approachable. And there are other like specific things she does that I appreciate of just using the word slave when it's most appropriate, rather than like constantly going to house servant and stuff like that. The ancient Greek world, as so many cultures have been through human history, is replete with slavery. Odysseus on his way home from Troy, he's fucking stopping off. And, this is something the movie just very much eases for the modern audience. He is slaughtering every fucking man living in that village. And he is taking all the children and women into slavery because that's what they did. They were raiders and pirates. She retains a lot of the brutality of the text as well. And that's one of the things that, of like retaining some of the kind of exotic foreign energy of it, that it's like, she's not trying to sort of shave down those pieces, which is something I also appreciated about the translation.
Yeah, and if you're doing serious study on the Odyssey, no single translation is going to be sufficient. You would have to look at multiple, because no one translation, no matter what, can get everything. And, it's kind of interesting. There was actually another major new translation that came out last year by a guy named Daniel Mendelsohn with University of Chicago Press. And I read last night just like the Kindle sample, and it had like the translator's notes and the first chapter. And one, I will say, his translator's introduction was like, I will say as an academic, I think inappropriately snippy towards Emily Wilson. Like, this translation is very clearly a clapback at her, and it's like, his specific problem was that she left out too much of the poem in his view because of the keeping the line lengths and all of that stuff. And like, I guess that's a fine complaint to have. I will say, she's your colleague if you're an academic. Like, back the fuck off. That's just like a little professional thing for me of like, you generally don't do that in this kind of thing. But anyway, I also think, though, he didn't give enough credit to like the idea of there is a real benefit to Emily Wilson's approach, which is that, yes, maybe not every single word or nuance from the Greek is represented there, although, again, I would argue no translation is going to do that, but it does get something that none of the others get, which is the pace. And, like, I do think that's, like, remarkably important. And, like, for me, that was very revelatory, was to have a version that just, to me, it gallops along because of that. It's iambic pentameter in a strict 5-beat line. So it's 10 syllables per line, and it just goes through the whole poem that way. And with the fairly, like, I don't want to use the word simple, because it's not like it's unsophisticated, but it's plain English for the most part. And I think that just, for me, I pick this version up, and I start reading, and I can't take a breath for parts of it, because it just goes and goes, and like, I find it myself, you can go through a chapter or a book of it very quickly, very easily, but without feeling like you're not getting something, complicated. I feel like you're still getting all of the basic nuance and themes of the story and all of that stuff. And I think, it's important to remember as something that was an oral tradition that was meant to be for, the Odyssey was never intended in ancient Greece to be for high academics only, right? It is something for public consumption, and I think Wilson's version does a really beautiful job of representing that quality of it and taking you along. And if you are interested in trying to see one that does as best as it can to translate word for word every single thing in the Greek, the Mendelsohn, that's its job. That's the 2025 version does that. I will say from the chapter I read, I think it's awkward as a piece of literature. I don't think it rolls off the tongue. He is trying to effectively reproduce dactylic hexameter in English, as he explains, and I think it's overly complicated. Like, I'll go to book one. Tell me the tale of a man, muse, who had so many roundabout ways to wander, driven off course after sacking Troy's hallowed keep. Many the people whose cities he saw and whose ways of thinking he learned. Many the toils he suffered at sea, anguish in his heart, as he struggled to safeguard his life and the homecoming of his companions. What you can see there is, it is also doing line for line the Greek, but it's making the line as long as it needs to be in English to get the full Greek line. And it's not bad, but I would not say this is like I would say academically there's probably a lot of value in this, but for just general readability, maybe not. And general readability should also be a consideration in translations of something like the Odyssey, because it is meant for public consumption.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I really love the Robert Fitzgerald translation. That's quite old at this point. I think he did this in the 50s. But it is not trying to do like a strict line count, keep that like in parity. But he is doing the things, like I said, with like the spellings to retain the like original Greek pronunciations and stuff like that. But it also, he just has a very elegaic style to his writing that I just think it's very well written. For instance, the opening, which he just did for that translation in Fitzgerald's, he says, "Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending, the wanderer harried for years on end after he plundered the stronghold on the proud height of Troy." And then goes on from there. But I think he has a good way of it is slightly more archaic language to retain that poetic style and tone to it, but it's also very beautifully written. So if people are interested in, like, maybe you read the Wilson translation, you're like, what is another good one to do that is maybe has more of the sort of like largesse of the text or all that kind of like fiddly detail, personally, I would go to the Robert Fitzgerald one.
And I've always wanted to read, because I've read parts of the Fitzgerald one, and I like the style a lot, and I would like to go to that one. Just for reference, since we're doing this, the Wilson, and I think this gives you a good example of the way she does it. It's tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. And it is clearly like less flowery and kind of like verbally rich than the Fitzgerald, but then I think as the Wilson doesn't sing as much in individual excerpts as like the Fitzgerald, but I think you see the benefit of it when you read long stretches of it, you know?
Yes, no, again, it feels like a text that is meant to be read by a modern audience and enjoyed. You know, and like I mean, the Fitzgerald one is sort of like that as well. It's just also like 70 years old. And so modern audiences' tastes in like literature and style is very different now than it was in the 1950s. So, yeah, it's, you know,
but the Fitzgerald one is cool.
These texts.
Yeah, and I know you love the Fitzgerald one. I also love the way he does. Everyone, like, you can kind of tell the quality of a translation by what it does for the first Odysseus epithet, but the man skilled in all ways of contending is a pretty fucking rad one. If you wanted like a term on your tombstone, that'd be a pretty sick way to be remembered.
Yeah, it's just, God, I just want someone to call me the man skilled in all ways of contending. Put that on a fucking business card. It's just, it makes you just seem so fucking badass. It's just really good.
But then, you know, you mentioned this earlier, I think the Wilson choice to just go really kind of intentionally flat and direct in that first line, tell me about a complicated man, that makes you sit up and take note, I think. And I also think it is kind of a thesis statement for how she presents a lot of this, is he is a complicated man. And the Odyssey doesn't tell you how to feel about him. It doesn't kind of editorialize in that way, in part because it's so much through his point of view. But obviously you are not supposed to get to the end and feel okay about all of this. And this is another, like, important corrective Wilson makes, is stuff like, just use the word slave. When it comes to the women at the end, she doesn't use, like, derogatory sexual language like sluts, which I think that's in the Fagles, is the women who are hung by Telemachus at the end. Just stuff like that of just, like, often she is much plainer in descriptions of things that are happening, which I don't think editorializes. It actually takes a step back and allows you to kind of editorialize on what you're reading, and I think that's really important for a text like this.
Yeah, and I think it's one thing that oftentimes in a modern context gets kind of messed up about how Greek mythological heroes are used, because we use this word hero, but from the Greek perspective, like, these heroes are not meant to be, like, strictly aspirational figures. They're not heroes in the way that, like, Captain America or Spider-Man is a hero. They're meant to be fucked up and do bad things. You know, like Achilles in the Iliad, when he kills Hector and then takes Hector's body and ties it up behind his chariot and rides that body around the walls of Troy, that's not meant to be a thing that you look up and go, man, what a badass Achilles is. You're supposed to go, what the fuck? Like, this dude is fucked up. You know, Heracles kills his wife and children. There's always, like, gods are involved in some of this stuff, and that's a difference between the ancient world and the modern perspective. I don't think the gods' involvement is meant to sort of remove the agency of the individual. It's meant to kind of, like, enhance or kind of make it more poetic or more kind of epic in their terms. But the sense of, like, these are complicated people who do amazing things and do terrible things, and they make horrifying mistakes that have horrifying consequences, and the Greeks fucking loved that shit. Like, they ate that shit up. It's like, it is so, you know, like, look at some of their most famous stories, like Oedipus Rex, Oedipus, not a super aspirational figure. I don't think the Greeks are saying we want everyone to go fuck their moms and kill their dads by accident, you know, but they loved those kinds of stories. And it's one of the things I think is makes, you know, Greek mythology so compelling, is because that's all what the gods are. You know, they're all messy bitches, every one of them. And it's like Greek literature and Greek, like, stories from that period are like that, top down. And it makes Odysseus just such a fun character, especially with stuff of, like, you know, the Greeks loved him, understood he was a messy bitch, but they loved him. And the Romans hated his guts. Like, the Romans hated Ulysses because they saw themselves as being descended from the people who fled after the sacking of Troy. And they're like, this lying, deceitful piece of shit, these, like, he's such a bastard and they hated him. And it's just the thing that, you know, it's why I do really love this choice of Wilson saying he's just a complicated guy, because it's just so true. Like, and it's true both within the story and it's true historically. That I think the way that a culture looks at the character of Odysseus and what they see in him, and what is appealing about him, tells you a lot about that culture and their specific values. That the Greeks liked his cunning and his deceit, but they also enjoyed seeing, you know, the folly of his arrogance and his hubris, and that's part of the flavor of the character. Whereas the Romans looked at the lying and deceitful cunningness of the character and was like, this guy is a piece of shit. like you shouldn't be going around disguising yourself and lying to people. It's a bad thing to do. And the Greeks are like, nah, that's some cool shit he's doing.
Absolutely. Have you still never played the Hades games, Sean?
No, I have not.
You'd love them, and I think part of it is because it has so much fun with the Greek characters and their myriad messy qualities. Like if ever in our modern times the Greek heroes and gods have been portrayed as messy bitches, it is in those games, and it's part of the absolute pleasures. That's a game made by a team that understands the pleasure of these stories is in how messy these characters are, because it obviously extends to the gods too, and all of that stuff. You know, they are as flawed as any of the humans in a lot of ways. That's like less prominent in the Odyssey than in other myths, but you get a little bit of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you get in the Odyssey, you know, and this is a thing that I struggled with the Nolan movie, is Athena in the original poem is one of the main characters, and I just love Athena. I think she is such a cool character, and it absolutely, there's this element of the story where, you know, she loves Odysseus because he is this fascinating guy who reflects her qualities, right? The thing that is part of one of his heroic epithets is the word, I think it's polymetus in Greek, which means like many-faced or like things like that. Poly, obviously many. Metis is kind of the word for wisdom, and Metis is the name of the goddess that was Athena's mother, that then Zeus had a prophecy that the pregnant Metis, the baby that she was going to give birth to, would be powerful enough to overthrow Zeus. Zeus can't have that shit, so he just eats the pregnant Metis alive, and then Metis gives birth to Athena, but really it is Zeus, and Athena bursts from his forehead, basically fully clothed, fully armored, with her spear in hand, and she becomes, instead of Metis' daughter, she is Zeus's daughter, birthed from Zeus himself. But anyways, like, Athena is this character who sees in Odysseus this quality that is hers, of wisdom, cunning, strategy. She is the goddess of war, but specifically she's the goddess of strategy. And that's like the wisdom part of her is that she's always clothed in armor, always has her spear. And so she sees this mortal that reflects these qualities in herself, and so she enjoys that. But, you know, she wants him to she wants to enhance the messy bitchiness of Odysseus. So she is the one who, for various reasons, sends the winds that cause the Greek fleets on their way home from Troy to go to, you know, all the ends of the earth, basically. And then she is constantly kind of just egging things on slightly, particularly when he gets home. Odysseus, there are a couple of times where he's like, maybe I can get through this without killing the suitors. And then Athena does something, like she makes Penelope like decide to walk out in front of the suitors to reignite their passions, things like that. And anytime it seems like there is a less violent way for this situation to be resolved, she steps in to nudge it towards this horrifying conclusion she wants, where she wants her boy, Odysseus, to fucking kick ass and kill all these bitches. And then as soon as he does, she runs up to Daddy Zeus and is like, well, are you really going to let this war continue? Are you really going to let the Ithacans keep fighting Odysseus? And Zeus is like, Athena, you're the one who made this happen. But it's like, okay, fine, I'll send down a thunderbolt and get the fighting to stop. But there's this wonderful quality to Athena in the story where, you know, she is helping Odysseus and she transforms him and lends him her powers and all these different things. But she really, what she wants is Odysseus to do some cool shit. And she wants to watch that happen. And it's such a delightful part of the story. And I just adore the gods in the Greek mythological stories because they're always very cool. But Athena, because she is cunning like Odysseus, is just the best, you know, because all the other gods are very like kind of forthright with what they want. Like if Zeus wants something, he just goes and does it. Athena just pushes and nudges behind the scenes to get the cool shit to go down.
No, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, Athena is the main character of the story because she is the person who's the consistent element through all of it, from the Telemachus chapters early on all the way through. The most absent, quote unquote, she is probably in the 4 flashback chapters. But even then, she's like obviously a force within the story. It's even if Odysseus isn't commenting on it as actively. I do struggle to imagine how I think you'd have to have a film with a very, very different style to have Athena like a really present character, because she is such a literary device of a character, because she transforms. She has no like stable shape in the narrative, right? She is someone who is constantly appearing in different guises, and she's running up to Mount Olympus and coming back down, and there's this ethereal quality that like it's one of the strengths of it as a piece of literature, is that is such a, it's something that can so alight your imagination. I think in the more concrete realm of cinema, it's something where I wonder how exactly you would do it. And I did like Nolan's interpretation of the gods are very present in the story, but as like natural events, like you feel Zeus concurrently, like consistently in the film at moments where like lightning strikes and things happen. And if you've read the book, you know where like Athena is, I think you can interpret there in the film early on in several moments where Telemachus is interacting with people who in the book are visages of Athena that he doesn't know that's who it is. But I think that has to be one of the trickiest things for anyone hoping to adapt it is, what do you do with the gods? Because they have to be there in some form, but they are obviously a very literary device, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we want to get into that whole conversation now, because that's like getting deep into the movie, or
sure.
we want to keep on the book. I think kind of keep a pin in that, because I've got a lot of thoughts on that, but I want to kind of stick with the original text for right now. Yeah. Let's see. What are some of the other elements of the text to hit on? Do we want to talk about some like the specific elements, or what?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on how deep you want to go into things. You know, I have some passages highlighted and stuff. You know, obviously, and I guess getting into that literary element, there are so many things in it that are about visages changing and whatnot. This is where like any film is going to have to kind of contend with how to do this. Is like obviously not just that Athena, what her physical form is completely inconsistent, right? Because she's always appearing in different people's bodies and visages and all of that stuff. But Odysseus himself is doing that constantly. He is constantly getting transformed. And, you know, they describe it as, like, at various points of, like, multiple feet added to his height as he became, or like with Telemachus, you know, she poured, you know, handsomeness on him and he stood up looking like a literal god and all of that stuff. And it's those elements that, in your imagination, you know, this is stuff you really couldn't do in a movie if you wanted to have like one actor playing the character, but like is something that is very literary and is part of the pleasure of the poem, is all of those ways that sort of visages and images change that is calling upon your imagination, right?
Yeah, and it reflects a culture that is, you know, lives very closely with this sort of notion of this polytheistic dimension, right? Where the gods are both, you know, these literary figures and these literary characters that exist in these stories that, you know, maybe some people take as those being actually real, or some people take them as just being stories. But they are also like literal gods that are actually worshipped, that, you know, all the things of like, and we got this, you know, this sheep and then we butchered it this way as a sacrifice to the gods. Those, of course, were all things that the ancient Greeks did. And they had festivals to specific gods. They had temples, specific gods, and sacrificed and did sacrifices to them and things like that. And there's just this sense of like the omnipresent of the divine intermingled with the contemporary world. There is no division. You know, there's no like, oh, the gods exist here because it's some weird island where the Cyclops is, but they don't exist at Ithaca. They're all always there all the time. And you never know, you know, kind of like what in the Nolan movie they call the rule of Zeus, but this idea of Xenia does come from the idea of Zeus, you know, is one of his many roles is he is the god of strangers, and very similar to like Odin in Norse mythology. You never know, like an old man on the street could be Zeus in disguise, kind of testing mortals and seeing what they're going to do. But I think that one of those things with the gods that's so fun is that sense of that they're not that different from people. You know, like the divine and the mundane, you know, the gods and mortals, there's a very thin line between them. And for the gods, it's just basically like what makes them gods. It's not that they are like ultimately good and moral entities or anything. It's that they're just very powerful and they can do what they want, especially Zeus, who is the most powerful and he can do anything that he wants. And I just love that sense of the kind of mystical world and the sort of plain world are not distinct. It's all just one thing, and it exists in this sort of like realm of mythology that feels so rich. And so when you read these kind of literary passages where Athena describes, or they describe like Athena, pouring her grace upon Odysseus and him stepping out, and all of a sudden he looks like not just that he is no longer in disguise, he appears as he did the day he left to go to Troy, and like tall and strong and vigorous and muscled and youthful in a way that he obviously couldn't be. In this way that the gods sort of like enhance these individual traits of people when they want at opportune moments. And that sense of, again, like I think to a modern audience is sometimes hard to parse because it feels like, well, is Odysseus ever really doing anything, or is it just constantly like the gods like making all of his schemes and all these things work? But it is not the right way to look at it, because there's no distinction between those. It is all this sort of like, this kind of invisible film that wraps around everything. It is all the gods and the mortals are so deeply intertwined, and the worlds they live in are so deeply intertwined that none of it is ever separated. And yes, like in that literary sense, that is much, much easier to express than it would be on film.
Yeah, and not just easier to express, but it is like, to some degree, the purpose of expression in poetry or literature is to be able to do those things, right? Is to be able to have, when it is text, the medium of expression is, verbal elements that then ignite in your imagination. And you can have, the endless budget of the mind to be able to kind of conjure and see whatever you want. And that is why, a story like this can flourish in this medium in its most natural form, is all of those elements. But that's one of the things that I think is one of the things that makes the Odyssey such a strong story is, as you said, the gods do have, excessive intervention in the events of the story. But I don't think, at least, my most recent reading of the Wilson translation, I never feel like it completely takes agency away from Odysseus, right? Like, that is, the gods do nothing to make him shout at the Cyclops and make the Cyclops, rain down stones upon his men and curse him to Poseidon. That's all him. Athena didn't do that, right? And there's like a lot of moments like that where obviously the gods, particularly Athena, create these spaces for the characters to do things, but then the most important character choices are often things they do. And I think there's actually a really good balance in the story that makes those, that actually highlights the points where the characters have agency. Like, I think particularly in the book, to me, the most powerful one is Odysseus is just completely unnecessary shit talking of the Cyclops once they're already away, where it is the stupidest fucking thing he does, and it really is all on him, right?
Oh yes, that is the hubris, that is the arrogance at work. This is like, I want everyone to know that I'm the one that I beat you, that I'm that man skilled in old ways of contending. I'm the guy who sacked Troy, and I'm the one that's gonna fuck your day up. Check it out, Odysseus, right here. He just puts a big neon sign pointing. It's like, I fucking did it. Praise me, bitches.
It's basically in The Simpsons when Homer's like, I'll never get my comeuppance, never! And then it, leads to him getting his comeuppance. And it's almost comical in that sense. I guess one other thing I wanted to talk about with it is, obviously I think the early parts of the Odyssey, particularly the flashback in the middle and all that stuff, gets plenty of discussion. The bulk of the book by volume is the Ithaca stuff in the latter half. That is the longest stretch. That is the most consistent. Like, we are in one mode of narration and in one period of time and all of that. And I think it is the part that I would imagine, and I think in my memory this is how I probably felt in high school, where if you are reading it for an assignment and you're a teenager, your interest probably falls off, because you'll eventually get to the bloodshed chapter, and that's exciting and full of gore and death and fighting. But a lot of it is people talking in rooms about what they may or may not do about this problem. And I think if you're, younger, that is much less exciting than going on to various islands and fighting various magical beings and all of those things. But as an adult, I like all that stuff with the mythology and the magical beings, but I get to the parts in Ithaca, I'm like, this is the good shit. This is where the character is most alive. This is where, in some ways, he is most active in that Lord of Lies sense, because he is just spinning these fucking endless yarns where he will go on pages of like, dude, this is a level of unnecessary backstory that would make J.R.R. Tolkien blush. Like, what the fuck? You don't even need all of this, but you're doing it. But then it also builds, I think, these... Because this is where obviously the theme of homecoming and Xenia and all of that is most powerfully expressed. And you get moments like one that I was very, very happy to see reproduced faithfully in the Nolan adaptation, which is Argos the dog. And what a powerful idea, the dog who lived 20 years to see his master again, and when he sees him again, he finally is able to shake off this mortal coil, and things like that. And the book has, you get characters like Eumaeus, the John Leguizamo character in the movie, who is one of the best characters in Homer, just like such an amazing figure. And I really do think that the last half, like that's, the Odyssey isn't the journey, it's the homecoming, and that part is so, so good.
Well, yeah, like, because it basically just turns into, like, a slow burn spy thriller, where Odysseus is, like, slowly laying out these schemes and plans of, like, okay, like, I'm now finally home. I've got to be in disguise. He's taken Agamemnon's advice, where Agamemnon in Hades was like, those women, you can't trust them. Like, it's like, they killed me. So it's like, hey, like, come in secret, and, don't just sort of, like, bust open the door and say, like, honey, I'm home. And so he's going through, and he's slowly gathering allies, trying to figure out when is the right time to reveal his identity to which people along the way. And it is just this sort of like fantastic little buildup of him putting all the pieces into place until you get that true bloodbath where, them moving the weapons and getting the weapons out of the room, him like slowly trying to like get the scenario for the test to occur, and him getting like Telemachus on his side, and all those little tiny elements rolling in until finally the time comes for him to string his bow and just kill these motherfuckers. And the massacre is just truly insane, like his whole, I mean, because this is one of the things that the original myth, especially if you read it in kind of context with the Iliad, is that it is a perfect inversion of the kind of epic duels that exist in this era of ancient Greek writing, where it is like, normally you have your kind of, this is basically how it works in modern action movies too. But you've got your hero, you've got the like main bad guy he needs to fight. Usually the main bad guy is going to have like a couple of sort of like lieutenants, and the hero needs to kind of take out the lieutenants first and then eventually work his way up to the main bad guy. I mean, then they're usually just kind of standing across a field and throwing spears at each other, because that's how the Iliad kind of displays most of these fights, which is probably fairly accurate. There was a lot of chucking javelins at motherfuckers, and you got to hope that the gods are going to make your javelin strike true. But there's this kind of like method to the slow buildup to this big duel between the two main heroes. And instead, in the original story, you have this sense of like Odysseus has set his plan into play. They lock all the doors. The suitors are totally unarmed. Odysseus has his bow, and the first dude he takes out is Antinous, who is the leader of the suitors. So it is this complete inversion. Instead of working his way up the ladder to the main bad guy, he's like, I'm gonna murder the shit out of you first. And I also love, like, literally how they do it is there's that little setup where a bit before it happens, Antinous is saying something to some other character, and then this narrative voice kind of like intercedes from our perspective and tells us, but what Antinous didn't know at that moment is that not only would he not succeed at this challenge, but he would be the first of them to die. And so like a few pages basically before it goes down, that like, oh, it's over for these fuckers. As soon as like the plan has reached this certain stage where there's no coming back from it, that like it's over. And there's this just such a beautiful sense of buildup and execution to it.
Here's how Wilson writes that part in the book, Sean, because I highlighted this. This is talking about Antinous. He hoped he would be first to string the bow and shoot through all the axes, but he would be first to taste an arrow from the hands of great Odysseus, whom he had mocked, urging the others on to do the same. Fucking great. Just call the shot right there. Because really, the build-up to the moment when he strings the bow is like the greatest build-up in storytelling history, and then it is a full chapter of release of just... Yeah. Absolute to the point where like the buildup is so good then the length of the release is what makes you feel so gross about it to some degree, right?
Yeah, because it's this thorough massacre of all these guys.
Yes.
You know, who they manage to kind of get some weapons and they sort of fight back a little bit, but you know, not all that much, and then they just slowly are just working their way, like, methodically. It's just, you know, you have that great section where it's just like, and then Telemachus killed this guy, and then this guy, and then this guy, and they all have names, and that's the very, like, Homeric Iliad kind of thing. And this guy, and then Eumaeus killed this guy, and Odysseus killed them, and him, and him, and him, and him, and it just goes down this list until basically everyone's dead, the floor is covered in blood, there's, like, the bard dude is, like, cowering under a table, and there's one other guy that Telemachus vouches for, and there's 100 dead men. It's like, well, like, that's some great work done. Now let's fucking run to my dad's house, Laertes, because everyone else in this town is not going to be happy we just did this.
Yes, it's at the worst detail in all of that is where you really feel the aftermath is. They then bring in, I think it's the 12 slave girls who laid with the suitors. And they they say basically, we're going to murder you, but first you have to clean up all of this. So they force the 12 slave girls to clean up the massacre. Then Telemachus takes them outside and hangs them all one by one. That part is particularly barbaric.
Yeah, well, because Odysseus tells him, like, hey, you just execute them. And then Telemachus is like, you know what? Like, they've been so awful. And there's just this spiteful thing. He's like, I'm going to hang them instead. Instead of just, like, cutting their heads off with the sword, I'm going to give them the slower, more painful death. Like, he deliberately makes it a more painful execution out of spite. Which, again, is the messy bitchiness of these characters, is that, like, you know, it is such a profound act of cruelty he does to these women, and then they just move on.
Yeah, that is a change in the film. The film is, and I understand for the themes it's going for, it's Odysseus is trying to keep the blood off of Telemachus's hands. That is a very big difference in the book, where he's like, Telemachus, come, get some blood. Get it on your hands, son.
And then Telemachus is like, I mean, that's a good idea, but what if I really made them suffer first? Like, well, how about that?
Yeah, it's fucked up. Again, this is where, as you say, the story can be very bracingly immediate and then very foreign. Very, very foreign to us. Of like, this isn't, again, if in our understanding of the word heroic, that is not a heroic action for Telemachus and his father.
Yes,
right?
These are not, like, profoundly moral people. That's not ever the way I think they're meant to have been read.
One of the passages, and I know you feel the same way, that I always love to see how different people translate, because this is the most, get hype moment in ancient literature, is when he strings the bow. And this is how it is in the Wilson, and I enjoyed this very much. So he had tricked them all. After examining the mighty bow carefully inch by inch, as easily as an experienced musician stretches a sheep-gut string around a lyre's peg and makes it fast, Odysseus with ease strung the great bow. He held it in his right hand and plucked the string, which sang like swallow song, a clear sweet note. The suitors, horrified, grew pale, and Zeus made ominous thunder rumble. Odysseus, who had so long been waiting, was glad to hear the signal from the son of double-dealing Cronus. He took up an arrow which was lying on the table. The others were all packed up in the quiver, soon to be used. That's a great detail. He laid it on the bridge, then pulled the notch end and the string together, still sitting in his chair. With careful aim he shot. The weighted tip of bronze flew through each axe head and then out on the other side. Fucking great. And this is a great detail I did just want to appreciate in the Nolan film, is he keeps the detail that Odysseus does all of that sitting down casually and then gets up for the slaughter. That's a great little detail.
Yeah, because it is described that he's sitting down and he would have, had the bow horizontal, which is how the ancient Greeks practiced archery. It's such a great section. I just want to also read the same passage from the Fitzgerald translation, just to, like, get the different element, because it's one of my favorites of the whole book. The way that Fitzgerald renders this sequence is he says, "But the man skilled in all ways of contending, satisfied by the great bow's look and heft, like a musician, like a harper, when with quiet hand upon his instrument he draws between his thumb and forefinger a sweet new string upon a peg. So effortlessly Odysseus in one motion strung the bow, then slid his right hand down the cord and plucked it, so the taut gut vibrating hummed and sang a swallow's note. In the hushed hall it smote the suitors, and all their faces changed. Then Zeus thundered overhead one loud crack for a sign, and Odysseus laughed within him that the son of crooked-minded Cronos had flung that omen down. He picked one ready arrow from his table, where it lay bare. The rest were waiting, still in the quiver, for the young men's turn to come. He knocked it. let it rest across the hand grip, and drew the string and grooved butt of the arrow, aiming from where he sat upon the stool. Now flashed arrow from twanging bow, clean as a whistle, through every socket ring, and grazed not one to thud with heavy brazen head beyond.
That's a really cool comparison because you can see all the exact same elements are there in both, and it's just sort of the arrangement of it and the tone of it, but they are both, they're both great. Again, it is the most get hype passage in ancient literature, right?
Yeah, and with the Fitzgerald one, just like on this thing, he has this very big, again, I described it earlier, this big postscript where he just goes through a bunch of like individual things about the translation. He spends a lot of time on that specific moment of like, of what are they describing the challenge as being? Because I thought this was interesting because the Nolan movie with a different interpretation where it's like, what is meant by Odysseus shooting the arrow through the axes? Fitzgerald's interpretation, and he goes through like pages of justification for why he's like, and I'm pretty sure this is what it is that they would have piled up a big mound of dirt and then taken the heads of the axes without the handle and put those vertically in the mound of dirt, lined through with a rope or something, so all the sockets were aligned and you're shooting the arrow through the sockets. Nolan in the movie does, this is like a thing you see in art and stuff like that as well, a different interpretation that was popular for a long time historically, which is that they take two axes and put them kind of cross from each other and create a space to shoot the arrow through. And I gotta say, I just strongly prefer the axe head one. I think the idea of shooting through the little like empty socket in the axe heads and going all the way through is such a like better visual for like how hard this shot must be, that it's not just you got to string the bow, it's you have to fire an arrow so flat, straight, and accurate that it goes straight through all of these, and like that kind of the way that Fitzgerald translates it as almost like the metal rings through as the arrow shoots through the holes is, I think that to me is what visually I think that scene should look like.
That is how I imagine it, too, when I read it. I do understand why, if you are using a camera and doing film and trying to make it coherent for the audience, you would do it. Again, it's in the same way that's how it's been rendered in, like, paintings and bronzes and stuff for, centuries. But yes, I think, again, you want to make it look kind of as hard as possible so he can do it as casually as possible and make it look like nothing.
Yeah, it's like I can just see in like my mind's eye the like anime version of the Odyssey, that just has this like incredible shot that follows the arrow through the fucking axe heads and shit.
There must actually be an anime Odyssey, but I do love the idea of like, let's get one of the like great current studios to do like UFO Table when they're done with Kimetsu can do the anime Odyssey where it is just as like over the top extra as fucking possible. That'd be pretty great.
Yeah, I mean, it would. I think anime would, or like it, doesn't have to be anime. Animation in general, would be a good medium because you could do things like the like Athena transforming into different
that'd
figures
be much easier,
and communicating that it's the same person visually and stuff like that. I don't think anyone would make it. Maybe now because this movie has made so much fucking money. But maybe someone will be like, hey, let's like do the reverse of what Disney has done, where they took all their animated movies and made them live action. Let's take all these live action movies and make them animated, and it would be sick.
I actually think you're completely right about that. The natural, if you were to adapt the Odyssey into a visual medium, I think the two most natural mediums to get all the poetic qualities would be either stage, because theater, there's a suspension of disbelief where you can do a lot of this, or animation. And animation has, you could do in your anime Odyssey cast, I don't know, Miyuki Sawashiro is Athena. You would like that, Sean.
Yeah, there you go.
And then have her do the voice of whoever Athena is in. And if it's a boy, she, goes deeper with it, and that'd be cool. And if it's, you can do whatever that is and have the voice be the thing that kind of signals that consistency. But it would be much easier to show her, going off to Mount Olympus and talking to Zeus. And you could make the gods look meaningfully different from humans to kind of signal that. There's all sorts of ways you could do that. And animation would be a really cool medium to do that in. So now I'm talking myself into wanting this. So,
yes.
Well,
yeah. and Athena is specifically her epithet. This is how they always describe her. She is Athena with her gleaming eyes or shining eyes, gray-eyed Athena, however you want to translate it.
Anime eye Athena, yeah.
Exactly, yes. But there's something specific about her eyes that distinguish her as Athena. Because, obviously it's meant to describe her as being so perceptive, she can see through anything. That absolutely animation can do cool eye stuff to sell the character.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're getting into Odyssey fanfic territory. In terms of the ending, so you have the whole bloodshed chapter, and then you have 2 books that are left. Yeah. And this was kind of interesting to me because I had not read in a while. I read chapter 23 in the Wilson translation. That's the chapter called The Olive Tree Bed. That chapter is principally about Penelope and Odysseus' reunion and ends with them in bed and him, they fuck, and then he's also, basically then they're after coital talk is him telling her all of his adventures, probably leaving out certain things that he did because it's his wife. And it's a beautiful chapter. There's some quotes in here that I absolutely love. And he also talks about that, I'm going to have to go again. And he tells her about the prophecy that he heard in Hades about how he needs to go to where the men no longer recognize what an oar is and all of that stuff. But then they're like, but we'll enjoy basically this moment together. And it feels like a very natural ending. And then you have book 24, which is a weird book. It's the first half of it is down in Hades, and it's basically all the suitors meeting other dead characters from the larger story like Agamemnon, and basically doing a recap of the Odyssey for everybody, the dead, and then you go back to Odysseus and Telemachus the next day, and they go meet Laertes, his father, which is kind of the only thread that hasn't been resolved yet. And you have that, and then all of the suitors' parents and families come, and then Zeus stops the fighting, and at the moment the fighting stops, the poem very suddenly stops. And I read that and I went, that was weird. And I went immediately back to the beginning of the book, and because I had not read the full scholarly introduction Emily Wilson had. Every translation has one of these. And I basically just fingered through the introduction until I found, where does she talk about how the ending is weird? And there's a whole section on it that there is no agreement by scholars over whether book 24 is actually an original part of the Odyssey, where it originally would have come in, what is odd about it, was it part of Homer, whoever Homer was, or what collective, blah, blah, blah. And so, but there is all this scholarly discourse about this, and I'm no expert in it, but if you ever have read it and gone, those last 2 chapters are a little odd, that is why. But there is also something compelling about what an ellipses the story ends on, of just it kind of ends mid-thought, and it really forces you to think about what's going to happen next. It does not do the, what I think of as the Grey Haven scene from Lord of the Rings of Odysseus leaving again, which is what Nolan does with it, and I think for a film completely appropriate to do that. But instead it ends with, that is going to happen, and this moment, and this is what Wilson says in her introduction that I think is a good read on it, that it ends with Odysseus ready to do more violence and being stopped by Athena for the first time, but he's ready to keep going. And that is suggestive in an interesting way.
Yeah. As you say, it is, I don't think any 2 scholars of the Odyssey agree on anything about it. It is just one of the most intensely debated. It must be the most intensely debated, maybe of the Bible, I guess now, but obviously this predates the Bible, because the ancient people were, the Romans debated about this shit. There's literally thousands of years of academic scholarly debate about the nature of all these things in the Odyssey. And it is definitely a sort of strange ending. All the stuff, the kind of the stuff with Penelope in the bed is so beautiful. I love the metaphor of the bed, of this bed that Odysseus built out of this one tree that they built the house around, and it's one of the posts on the bed obviously has this sort of metaphor for their marriage, that hey, a lot of bad stuff may happen, but this thing is always rooted. And Penelope tricks Odysseus by saying it's she tells one of the slave women, hey, go bring his bed out into the hallway so you can sleep there while we try to figure this, if this is really Odysseus or not. And he's like, woman, what did you do with my bed? Which is almost literally what the translation I think is also. And that's where she tricks him, and he explains the whole story, and that proves to her that he must be Odysseus. Or I think another way to read that scene is that Penelope is kind of taking the shit out of him, because she's you've been gone for 20 years, sorry. He's been gone 10 years to Troy, 10 years to get back, been gone for 20 years. That's a long time. And she's maybe kind of poking at him a little bit, but it's I think it's just a fantastic image. And then, then it continues on where you see Agamemnon sees all the dead suitors come in, and then he's like, "What the fuck happened? Like, where did all you guys come from?" I just love this moment of them like kind of explaining it to him, and I love Agamemnon's reaction is like, "Well, good for Odysseus. Like, great. Like, I'm just like, he, like that shit, like what happened to me didn't happen to him. He defended his home. He killed all these fuckers. Like, that's awesome." And I just love Agamemnon's reaction to it. Is he's just like, finally, like someone, heeded my advice, and I'm glad that it worked out okay for him. While this like 100 dead young men are standing in front of him. And then, yeah, I do think like this, I've always found the ending, the final moment of the story to be very like difficult. It obviously, again, there's all this scholarly debate about like the origins of it, because, anything that is difficult in a text is something that is with enough time. This happens with Shakespeare shit all the time. Of like, who really wrote this section? Is this actually blah, 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 blah? And obviously there's, who knows? Like, it could be that this is like a later edition that didn't fit in, or maybe there was more to the story that we never have, and there was going to be a book 25 and that never got written down. Who knows? But I do think there is something actually compelling about that moment where it ends. And I think it is that detail of that Odysseus is like, Zeus sends the thunderbolt. They kill the one guy. They kill Antinous' dad. He's the only one who dies. That dude gets fucking murdered. Where I think it's like Odysseus like throws a spear that's empowered by the gods and just travels crazy far and just smotes this dude dead. And then they're like, okay, let's stop. And then Odysseus is like, let's go. And he's going to go for more. And then it's like, no, seriously, fucking stop. Everyone go home. It's over. It's like Athena's like, I've got what I needed out of this. Like, let's wrap up and go home. And of course, hanging over the ending is you have this knowledge of where Odysseus' next journey is going to go. But it kind of, there is something powerful about this, like, forceful closing of the story by Athena. Like, I got what I wanted. I got the thing that was set out is that this is a story about this guy going home and setting his household right. And we have now done it, and it needs to end now. And it's over. And there is something very evocative and powerful about that ending, I think, in its own way.
Well, why don't I read this out to people who maybe haven't read it? This is from the Wilson translation. This is the last page or so. Odysseus charged the front line, his radiant sun behind him. They hacked with swords and curving spears. They would have killed them all and made sure none of them could go back home. But then Athena spoke, her voice held back the fighters. Ithacans, stop this destructive war, shed no more blood, and go your separate ways at once. Her voice struck them with pale green fear and made them drop their weapons. They were desperate to save their lives, and they turned back towards the city. Unwavering Odysseus let out a dreadful roar, then crouched and swooped upon them, just like an eagle flying from above. But Zeus sent down a thunderbolt which fell in front of his own daughter, great Athena. She looked at him with steely eyes and said, Odysseus, you are adaptable. You always find solutions. Stop this war or Zeus will be enraged at you. He was glad to obey her. Then Athena made the warring sides swear solemn oaths of peace for future times, still in her guise as mentor. And that's the end. But particularly the last bit of Athena dialogue, Odysseus, you are adaptable. You always find solutions. I really like that as like the last thing addressed at the main character.
Yeah, that's like it's time to try to adapt to this new world you're going to live in, where it's not just I got to murder everybody I'm running into. Especially because if they had killed all those people, I don't think there would have been an Ithaca to be king of at this point, because they would have killed most of the people in the town. It's a great ending, and then you of course have that just sort of beautifully evocative idea of the prophecy that Tiresias gives him in Hades, which is he must take go inland, put an oar over his shoulders, and travel so far inland that he meets somebody who looks at him and says, basically, what the fuck is that huge fan you're carrying around? And at that point, you stop and make a sacrifice to the gods, because at that point, you have basically what Tiresias is telling him is you must travel to the end of the world, right? Because keep in mind, we're the ancient Greeks, these are seafaring people. They all live on the Mediterranean Sea. The Ithaca is a little island there. That Ithaca is the Ithaca of the Odyssey. Again, endless scholarly debate about any of the locations, including the ones that are literally named, about is this actually where that's supposed to be? Or did someone just decide later to call this island Ithaca? Who knows? But this notion of you're basically traveling to a place that nobody in our world has ever been, which is a place where nobody knows about the sea. And realistically speaking, is a place that can't exist, because you know, I mean, I guess maybe if he encounters some like nomadic peoples living in the desert, maybe they wouldn't know what an ore is. But it seems very unrealistic to me that because it's not just someone who doesn't live on the sea, but also people who don't live by any rivers, which is kind of hard to do, particularly when you're talking 800 BCE. And so there is just something I've always found so powerfully evocative about this image of the great man of the sea go to the land, take this ore, and travel so far that this thing you've made your life by is a thing that these people have never even heard of. And that's where you must go to make your sacrifice, to make amends for all the offenses you have committed in your life. And it's like what a just incredible notion that is, and just so poetically put in the story.
I completely agree. I mean, to me, that is like the masterstroke of the Odyssey, right? Because this is just a very, very basic narrative principle, and it's so basic it stretches back to ancient Greece, which is that if you have a character, it's want versus need. If you have a character who sets out on a story and they want to do something, and you end the story with them just uncomplicatedly doing it and getting what they wanted, you've told a bad story. You've told a boring story. If Odysseus's goal, as it is for much of the poem, is to get home and put his house in order, and if he just did that, and then you were done, it wouldn't be anywhere near as rich of a story. But if you do it you're going to do all of that, and then you can't actually stay there. That your Odyssey is much, much bigger than this one thing. Your journeys will continue effectively forever. Because as you say, it's a prophecy that effectively is saying you need to keep journeying forever. Because this is an impossible thing we've set for you. Then that is what makes the story resonate beyond the bounds of the text itself. And it's just something that, again, every storyteller needs to remind themselves, if you gotta, whatever this character wants in the first act has to either change or be complicated by the third. It is so basic that it stretches all the way back to Homer, and it's so essential.
Yeah. And it's just, it's just making me think about, if you were doing the modern day version of the Odyssey, like what is the thing for us that is, because again, like the ore is like the symbol of life for the ancient Greeks. So I like that it's like you must go get, a Big Mac. And then you must walk and keep walking until somebody looks at the thing in your hand and says, what's that weird ass sandwich you're carrying around? And that's where you must stop and bury it and give sacrifice to the gods. It's like,
I thought you were going to say a smartphone.
Yeah.
Go find someone who doesn't know what an iPhone is.
It's like, what's this fucking black rectangle you're hauling around everywhere? It's like, my journey has had an end. Yeah.
It's great. Before we move on to talk about the film, are there any particular passages you just wanted to look at? Because I have one in particular I would love to read, just because it's my favorite in the book, or at least in the Wilson translation, and I wondered if you had any others, Sean.
I think we hit a lot of the really big ones. Let's go with I'll kind of look through mine because I have them kind of like dog-eared. If you have one that you want to talk about.
Well, my favorite one, and I think this is just, I think in Wilson's writing, I think this is particularly beautiful. This is in chapter 23. It's around line 230. That's a little after that. And it is when Odysseus is back in bed for the first time with Penelope. And it says, he held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it with great waves and driving winds, a few escape the sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land. So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck. I love that paragraph. I love that obviously everything in Homer is a giant metaphor. It's just constant this compared to this, right? But I think that is a particularly beautiful metaphor, in particular for how it brings in the shipwreck Poseidon imagery that is so central to Odysseus. And there's also a little literary trick there I love, that it starts on Odysseus's weeping joy to be back in her arms, and through the metaphor, it turns around and is now her, like, intense weeping joy, and it's very seamless in how it goes from him to her. I think it is one of those beautiful quotes about love that, you could read at weddings alongside Corinthians or something. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, that's a great one. A kind of like similar thing, but on the other side of the story. I think one of the characters that I particularly like in Wilson's translation, because I think she just like captures, I don't know, the energy of the character, is Calypso. He was only in really book 5, the goddess that, of course, Odysseus is kind of with for the 7 years he's there. And so I'm just going to read some of the section with her. So this is after Calypso is told by Hermes that she must let Odysseus go, and she tells him that she's going to do this. And then Odysseus, this picks up with him. It says, Odysseus, informed by many years of pain and loss, shuddered and let his words fly out at her. Goddess, you have some other scheme in mind, not my safe passage. You are telling me to cross this vast and terrifying gulf in just a raft when even stable schooners sped on by winds from Zeus would not succeed? No, goddess, I will not get on a raft unless you swear to me a mighty oath you are not planning yet more pain for me. At that, divine Calypso smiled at him. She reached out and caressed him with her hand, saying, You scalawag, what you have said shows that you understand how these things work. But by this earth and by the sky above and by the waters of the Styx below, which is the strongest oath for blessed gods, I swear I will not plot more pain for you. I've made plans for you as I would do for my own self if I were in your place. I'm not made of iron. No, my heart is kind and decent, and I pity you. And with those words, the goddess quickly turned and led the way. He followed in her footsteps. They reached the cave together, man and goddess. The chair that Hermes had been sitting on was empty now. Odysseus sat there. The goddess gave him human food and drink. She sat and faced godlike Odysseus while slave girls brought her nectar and ambrosia. They reached to take the good things set before them and satisfied their hunger and their thirst. The goddess queen began, Odysseus, son of Laertes, blessed by Zeus, your plans are always changing. Do you really want to go back to that home you love so much? Well then, goodbye. But if you understood how glutted you will be with suffering before you reach your home, you would stay here with me and be immortal. Though you might still wish to see that wife you always pine for. And anyway, I know my body is better than hers is, and I am taller too. Mortals can never rival the immortals in beauty. So Odysseus with tact said, Do not be enraged at me, great goddess. You are quite right. Quite right. I know my modest wife Penelope could never match your beauty. She is a human. You are a deathless, ageless, but even so, I want to go back home, and every day I hope that day will come. If some god strikes me on the wine-dark sea, I will endure it. But now I am used to suffering. I've gone through so much at sea and in the war. Let this come too. The sun went down and brought the darkness on. They went inside the hollow cave and took the pleasure of their love held close together.
It's really good. Yeah. The choice of the word scalawag there is particularly, that's a great one.
I just think it communicates so much of the idea, because this is a section in the story that you don't see much of, is his actual time with Calypso, but he spends so long with her, and the sense of this goddess that, she really does love Odysseus, and she wants him to be there with her, and she offers to make him an immortal, to basically bring him up to godhood. And there's something I think powerful about the image of Odysseus. She's always there. Years and years and years after enjoying the paradise and sleeping with Calypso, eventually he reaches the point where he is sitting on the coast, looking out at sea, always weeping, always pining for this life. And I love Calypso's I know your wife's not as good as me. I'm a fucking goddess. But fine, sure. You want to go be with that fucking mortal, whatever. And the way that she both is very affectionate with him, but also just kind of fed up with this, of her being like, I'm an actual goddess. I am perfection personified. And okay, fine, go home to your wife, weirdo. And there's just a great energy to it that I think particularly Wilson's translation captures.
Go home to your wife, weirdo. I would love it if she just translated that there. It's great. But no, I agree. And in general, I don't want to be overly reductive about the Emily Wilson. It's done by a woman, so therefore she is good with the women characters. But she is really good with the women in the story. They are very evocative characters in her telling in a way that I think is a distinct advantage of the story. And I think Calypso is an obvious one. I think Penelope, there's you talked about Fitzgerald, long translation note about how to do the axes. Wilson in her translation has a long note about the line of Penelope picking up the key to the armory to go get the bow. And she talks about, she describes Penelope's hand as muscled. And describes what the word is in Greek and the long chain of thought to get to the word muscled and why she uses it and its connections to she is someone who is weaving all day, and so her hand would be this way. But the point of the word is because it literally means thick, but if you use thick, which other translators have used, it almost sounds like a negative to say about her hand. And the point is it's strong, and it's supposed to represent there's a strength to this character. And you can also tell how much I think that backfills much of her interpretation of Penelope as a translator. And it's that kind of stuff that I think there's that attention to detail is something that is an advantage of the Wilson translation.
Yeah, and I think it's just like, every translator is going to pick up on different or prioritize different nuances, especially with, again, a text like this where, from what I understand, there are just truly... there's a lot of interpretational work of understanding the grammar of the sentence and like, what is this verb referring to? Like one of the Fitzgerald ones that he talks a lot about is the scene, and Wilson basically describes it very similar to Fitzgerald early on, where the suitors see this kind of omen that, of course, they ignore. This is before, like right before Telemachus leaves Ithaca to go on his journey, and they see these two eagles that come out, and the eagles dip down and they start clawing at the suitors' faces. Eagles, of course, representing Zeus in Greek mythology. But like apparently there's a long tradition of translations that said that the eagles were clawing at each other. And like Fitzgerald, again, it's like a 5-page thing describing, well, here's why I'm interpreting the grammar this way. And so much of it is about like the context and what interpretationally makes sense. And it's just one of the things that I think makes it a very interesting text to read multiple translations of, because there's so much you can do. There's so much wiggle room in how you're reading and interpreting the text. And it's also why it is this fertile ground for like the most epic ongoing scholarly wars of all time. It's like, how do you interpret what and who was Homer and where is this and is this supposed to be part of it and all that kind of stuff.
It's the thing to remember about translation, particularly with something in this sense that is so ancient. You can't go to contemporary speakers of ancient Greek and like have a long conversation, right? It's like this is so ancient, so foreign, that every translation is in essence an adaptation, right? Yeah. It is a new work of literature based on this old work. And so, to some degree, the lens of like how accurate is it, I think is, and I think this about all works of adaptation, is the wrong lens. It's how thoughtful is it? What particular things is it bringing out? Because you can't bring out everything. So what is this version's strengths? What is this version's strengths? And that is also why you can never have too many translations of it, because you will get different things out of it.
Absolutely.
Well, with that in mind, do you want to transition into talking about the Christopher Nolan film?
Yes, absolutely. I know that you had a real journey. You had your own Odyssey to watch this movie.
Okay, I'll do this briefly. So, one of the big things with this movie is Chris Nolan has been shooting on IMAX 70mm film, 15 perf, 65mm for almost 20 years, since The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight had about 25 minutes shot that way, but it was released on IMAX prints with the 35 sections blown up to match. And then he's done that again for Dark Knight Rises, Interstellar. Then with Dunkirk, he started shooting on a mix of 15 perf IMAX 70 and normal 6 perf 70mm. And then for this film, he's transitioned. Basically, IMAX finally was able to devise a camera system that could allow for the entire film to be shot in IMAX, which is fucking cool. I know a lot of people are trying to be too cool and be like, does it really? But yeah, it does fucking matter. It's really fucking sick when people do cool stuff with cameras. What else are we making $100 million movies for? Shut the fuck up. It's cool. Now, the problem is, not a lot of theaters know how to project film anymore. It's a commercial imperative. And to be clear, you get all these benefits digitally too. This is another thing people don't understand, is that if you shoot on film, it still does look better digitally because it's a scan of that content and it looks cool. So all of that, is neat. And so the movie has been released in a variety of formats. There are 41 theaters on Earth that can show the full IMAX 70 version, the 15 perf, full frame, 1:4:3:1 version of the film on physical celluloid in IMAX. And actually that number, I can tell you now, is 39. It might be lower than that because there are 2 theaters in Colorado that can do it, and both of them failed this weekend. And I know one of those firsthand, and I know one of those from reading Reddit. So I actually saw the film the first time on Friday, because I basically had 2 sets of people who wanted to see the movie with me, and so I just made separate plans. And there's a theater near me that was showing a standard 70 millimeter print. So that would be taken from the IMAX 70, but basically this would be the standard 70 millimeter shape, which is 220 to 1, and it's just a standard 70 millimeter print in widescreen. And I saw that. It was absolutely gorgeous, except that the projector was very slightly out of focus, right dead center in the frame, which is the worst spot for the projector to be slightly out of focus. And that annoyed me, but overall it's still beautiful, beautiful film print. I mean, if you've never seen 70, because I now have also seen the movie in Dolby Vision, which is a 4K projection system, and I mean, standard 70, let alone IMAX, has multiple times the resolution detail of any digital thing you can see today. And so there's just so much more in the image. There's so much depth to the colors. It's really, really cool. If you have a chance to see this movie on film, be it 3570, IMAX 70, and you trust the theater that is doing it, it would be worthwhile. Then I also had a ticket to see the IMAX 70 version. This was at the United Artists Colorado Center. Now, this is the oldest big real IMAX theater in Colorado. This is the IMAX that when movies, because for a long time IMAX was just a thing in museums, and movies weren't really shown that way. This was the first theater in Denver that actually showed movies that way. It's a proper, 5-story tall, 1:43 to 1, big IMAX, and for a long time they had an IMAX 70 projector. This is where I saw The Dark Knight on IMAX for the first time, and all of Nolan's movies shot that way up through Interstellar, and lots of other films, because movies were widely released on IMAX 70 even if they weren't shot that way. Just as back in the 70s and 80s, you had movies shot on 35 that were blown up to 70 millimeter prints for special presentations. And it was like the gold standard theater in Colorado at the time, because it was this big IMAX 70 millimeter projector. It was this giant screen. It was so cool. And I went to a lot of showings there. This was so far back in the day that this was before you had reserved seats in theaters. So you would have to show up like 2 hours ahead of time, and they have this big staircase where you could wait for lines, because obviously you have to climb way up this staircase to get to the big, 10-story tall screen, and you would just wait, and then you would hopefully get a good seat. I want to say I think one of the best developments in movie theaters has been reserved seating. That has made everything so much easier. Anyway, it was really cool. After Interstellar, inexplicably, this theater stopped using that projection system, and they replaced it with a digital IMAX Xenon system. And if you don't know, early digital IMAX projectors were really bad. They were 2K only. They were low resolution. They were exactly wrong for what IMAX should be. Today, most digital IMAXs are 4K dual laser projection, which gives you effectively HDR in a movie theater, and they're really, really good. Today's digital IMAXs are very good. At the time, it was such a downgrade, because also digital IMAX is 1.9 to 1, so it couldn't even use the full space of this historic screen that they had. And that is how the UA Colorado Center has been doing things for 12 years. Even when Nolan did Dunkirk and Tenet and Oppenheimer, huge movies that you would make a lot of money from, they didn't start using their 70 millimeter projector again. Finally, I guess the Odyssey was hyped enough that they brought it out of retirement, and they used it, and that seemed like it was going to be really cool. I have not gotten to see an IMAX 70 print since Interstellar in 2014, and I do hold it is the coolest thing you can see. If you can ever see it, it is the coolest thing, and I was willing to risk going back to a Regal theater, and Regal is the worst theater chain in America. They are just by far the worst. They have the most quality control issues. They have the worst pricing, all of it, but I was willing to risk it because I truly do love this format. So, we get to the movie. The movie is scheduled to start at 11:40 a.m., and there are no trailers planned. There's going to be, on the IMAX prints, there is a scene from Dune Part 3 attached to it as a little advertisement, but there is no other trailer. So it's supposed to start at 11:40. At 11:40 on the dot, they do start. We see the first 20, 30 seconds of the Dune thing, and then it stops and turns off, and the lights come on. And I'm like, uh-oh. And in my heart, I knew we're not seeing the movie. I just knew, look, I am an expert at this. I know when film is working and when it's not. I just knew it wasn't working. My one hope was most of the audience were fucking idiots and hadn't sat down yet. Like, a lot of people, I guess, assumed there would be 40 minutes of trailers. And even though this was a very expensive movie ticket, they got there late. So people kept streaming in for like 20 minutes. And I started getting worried at about probably 15 minutes after. I'm like, okay, most people are sat down. Because I was wondering, did they turn it off to let people sit down? That would be a reasonable thing to do, to be clear. If the audience isn't there, it's okay to hold it a little bit. It gets to noon. We haven't heard anything. Nothing's happened. It gets later and later. 34 minutes after showtime, so this would be like at 12:14, a lady comes in who was a staff member and says, hey, we don't know what's going on. We need to talk to the projectionist and we'll get back to you. And I'm thinking, this is not the order of operations. You've had 34 minutes to ask the projectionist. I don't believe they're in a hallowed hall that you cannot reach. Why give us an update if you haven't checked?
We have to solve the riddle to get to where the projectionist is in order to ask them what's happening.
Finally, about 40 minutes after showtime, a manager comes in and tells us that they're having a problem getting the film, because the film had started several times and would play for about 20 seconds and then stop. And they said they were having trouble getting the projector to last more than 30 seconds. At this point, I'm 100% confident it's not happening. Finally, about probably an hour after showtime, she calls it and says, we're canceling. We can't figure out how to show the movie. I'm like, okay, this sucks. They had no plan for what to do if the movie got canceled, which is extra stupid when you are working with something that can fail, physical film. Their way to refund people was to go, they had one iPad that could do this. I want to stress, this is like a movie palace kind of thing. There were hundreds of people there. And their plan was to go one by one through the theater, and it would have taken longer than the movie itself. And that was the plan. It was awful. But about 20 minutes after they started the refund process, and in that 20 minutes, they'd gotten through maybe 4 people. I mean, it was like just atrocious. They finally, the projectionist called the manager and said, hey, I think I figured it out. And so like, oh, great. Okay, we'll show the movie. I also want to say the manager was being snippy and awful about this. Like, you should be grateful we're trying to give you the thing you paid exorbitant amounts for. And she literally said when the projectionist called her and said, hey, I think I can show it, she said, okay, I guess we're going to do it. It'll push back our plans today, so I hope you guys are happy. And it's like, that you're providing the service we paid for? Yes. I do hope it makes us happy, asshole. Anyway, so they start the movie again. We get through the Dune trailer. We get about 2 minutes into the movie, basically when Elliot Page gets shot with the arrow, and then it all stops again. And it's like, okay, we can't do it. And at that point, they didn't come back in and say anything. I just finally said to my brother who I was with, I said, this isn't happening. And I got up and I said, I'm going to go figure out the refund thing. And so I went out to guest services. It took about another 20 minutes of standing in line to get my refund. And then they also said, because everyone had bought concessions, I'm like, we can't use these now. And I said, will you refund concessions? They said, yes, we have a line over there to refund concessions. We went over and stood in that line for another 20 minutes. The person with the iPad could never figure out how to do it. And finally we left and we said, okay, concession money is down the drain. There's nothing we can do about it. This is the worst experience I've ever had in a movie theater. I've had bad experiences before. The unprofessionalism of it was what baffled me. I understand mistakes happen. I understand this is volatile equipment. I do think with something like this shouldn't be happening. This should be tested. This should be understood. I think it is a mix of both. Regal as a chain is awful, and of course they have long since fired anyone who knew how to do this. But I also think, like, if I'm Universal Pictures and I'm releasing the Odyssey, 41 theaters on Earth can do this. I would train 82 people, and I would send them in pairs of 2 to every theater, and just say, we will pay for your hotel for the 3 weeks this is in theaters to run the projectors, and you will be our experts. And I would not let the individual theater chains touch the projectors. That's how I would do it. That's not how they did it. It was awful. But again, mistakes happen. I'm around film a lot. I know things, even the most experienced projectionist on Earth can run into things that are wrong. I don't think that's what happened here, but I know it can happen. Not having any kind of plan of how to deal with it, just awful. And I could only imagine, the only pleasure I got was, what if Christopher Nolan was here seeing this? How fast would he die of an aneurysm? Because also, I want to say, they didn't even have the projection right in the little glimpses we saw. It wasn't, they didn't have the focus right to like fully fill the screen, so it got narrower as it got taller. You should be able to fix it so it's like even with the screen. All this stuff. Honestly, I'm not saying I could go back and fix it, but I could probably give more pointers than a lot of people working there. It was bad. It was very disappointing. The next day, my brother and I went to see it in Dolby Cinema, which not as good, but I mean, it was better than what we got because they actually showed the movie and it looked good and it sounded good and it was totally fine and it was fine. So it's a bummer. I am 100% in favor of Nolan and anyone else shooting on whatever format they want. For one, that is their right as an artist. 2, it works commercially. It is a good thing to get butts in seats. This worked for Sinners last year, for instance, with Ryan Coogler. People like the spectacle of it, and they should. If you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a movie, it shouldn't look like Marvel garbage. It should look the coolest it can possibly look. You should be inventing new cameras. You should be doing all of this. This is what we want. It just sucks that the industry like, Chris Nolan is a powerful filmmaker. He's not powerful enough to make Regal and AMC rehire projectionists. And, like, that's the problem that is the limiting factor here. And I don't know what the answer is, but it is disappointing.
Yeah, it does just feel crazy because it's like, I think it so clearly is the future for like theatrical screenings of things that like
Yes.
you would have these kind of very premium style formats for these like big movies that are interesting movies. Like I just think like the Marvel era is done, and it's like there's just a different future for the industry, and it is a more niche and more premium experience. I mean, obviously you like still have regular projections or you know the digital projections and whatever for regular theaters, but like to supplement that with these more premium and more expensive style experiences should be the thing that these theaters are prioritizing, because I think it's the way that they can continue to survive. And so it is kind of crazy. Now, I do like to imagine Christopher Nolan being there in that theater, and then like at 30 minutes into this not working, you just hear the ding from the back, and he just starts shooting fucking arrows at the people like failing to give refunds. He's like, I'm done. I've given up. I brought this like prop from the movie to show off for like a special thing I was going to do after the screening, but it's over. Shoot, shoot, shoot. It starts like, getting people down with the bow.
Oh, and here's the aftermath, by the way, because I did a whole thread on this that kind of blew up on Blue Sky, but I also then looked on Reddit because there was a lot of discussion in like various threads. As far as I know, that projector is down all week for this opening week. They have canceled all IMAX 70 screenings or replaced them digitally. But here's the kicker, Sean. So this was Saturday morning. They had to cancel all the shows on Saturday. Or replaced. They replaced them starting at the 3 p.m. show with digital screenings, which I have to say, if you paid $35 for a 70mm ticket and then you got shitty 2K oh my god, that's a downgrade. But anyway, they replaced that. Then the next morning, they were still showing it digitally, and the digital projector failed. I don't even know how digital projectors failed. This is the premier IMAX in the state of Colorado, and they couldn't show it. And I heard through the grapevine, the other IMAX 70 in the state is in Colorado Springs, and it failed on Saturday. Nobody can figure this. What the fuck?
It's like, well, I think the answer clearly is we got to take that 70mm camera or projector and put it over your shoulder and keep on walking until someone's like, what the fuck are you carrying around? And you stop right there, you sacrifice a goat to Zeus or Poseidon and be like, I'm real sorry. I don't know what the fuck we did to anger you, but please, could you bless the movie theaters in Colorado again?
I know, it's too bad. And Sean, I was so excited because I lived for 6 years in Iowa where we didn't even have an IMAX. I didn't go to an IMAX for 6 years because there wasn't digital film, whatever. It wasn't around me. And so I was very excited to get to do this. And I was glad I got to see the 70mm presentation, even though the projector was not perfectly in focus. It was still very cool. But yeah, one other thing I want to say and clear up right now before we get into like the content of the film itself, about the photography. There has been so much disinformation online about how this movie was shot. It is not a poor tax that you cannot see the movie in the IMAX aspect ratio, guys. It is not a classist warfare thing. The movie, if you are seeing a different aspect ratio of the film, while you are technically seeing less of the captured film, you are not seeing less of the film. I need people to understand this, because this movie was shot in full IMAX, which is a full frame of 1:47:1. Unless you are in a literal IMAX theater that can show that is not the intended aspect ratio, because it's a lot of effectively dead air on the top and bottom. And if you are in a big IMAX auditorium where it is literally bigger than your eyes can take in, that's really cool because it's all this extra peripheral space that is immersive. But if you are in, say, an auditorium that has a wall-to-wall 2:35:1 screen, the movie was shot protected to look really good and tight in that aspect ratio, and it will look better in that shape because it will emphasize the horizontality of the space you are in. This is how Nolan shoots his movies. This is how a lot of people have done it ever since he started the IMAX kind of revolution with The Dark Knight, is that you shoot, and actually he didn't come up with this. This goes all the way back to the birth of widescreen in the 1950s, is you shoot to protect multiple aspect ratios, and Nolan and his cinematographer, Hoyte van Hoytema, are very talented at this. I have seen this movie now in 220:1, which is the 70mm shape, and I've seen it in Dolby Cinema, which does it in 185:1, which has more on the top and bottom. That's really cool in Dolby Cinema. I will say, compositionally, if you're judging it on how good is the picture, the 70mm is a better composition. It is tighter, it is clearer, it's got that horizontality that's really strong. But if you're then in a space that has a big, tall screen, it's cool to have the peripheral information. Nolan is not trying to cheat you by not letting you see all of the image. This is a standard compositional practice. You can go back to a famous example of this is On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando. If you buy the Criterion set of that movie, has 3 presentations in 133:1, 166:1, and 185 because they knew, because of the widescreen transition, theaters would have different size screens, and so the cinematographer of that movie protected for all 3, and it is worth watching in all 3 because you'll see slightly different kinds of compositions, where he'll frame for maybe the top of the head here, but he'll frame for a sign above that head here, and he'll frame for something else here, and that's exactly the strategy at use in the Odyssey. You will see different framings depending on how you see it, but they are all compositionally, photographically valid. No one is trying to cheat you, I promise. Please read a fucking book and do not go on Instagram and parrot this bullshit. I'm sorry, this is like a bugaboo for me.
Yeah, I mean, this is not exactly the same scenario, but it kind of reminds me of the mindset you see sometimes with people with video games, where they like try to go and mod a game to remove the like black bars at the top and bottom of the screen for cutscenes, because like
yes.
well, they're cheating me out of the full image. It's like, I don't think that's what they're trying to do. It's like, just because there's more stuff on the screen doesn't mean that it's better. Or it's like, you know, when someone takes something for 4:3 and just crops it to be 16:9 to fill their TV screen. It's yes. Like, well, it's better because it's you know, I'm just seeing a bigger thing. It's like, no, please, please, that's not how any of this works.
Well, I mean, and factually, basically any movie shot in flat widescreen, which is 185:1, like the shape of your TV, for most of film history, every movie shot that way was technically shot in 133 and matted down. So every movie you've ever seen like that has extra picture that you've been cheated out of, but that's because that extra picture includes the boom mic and parts of the set they don't want you to see, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, let's all just be fucking normal about this, because I think you and I will be in complete agreement on this, Sean. The Odyssey is a gorgeous fucking movie. Yes, and however you see it, it is a stunning piece of cinematography. It is a stunning, you know, act of production design and location shooting and all of this. And it is actually, I think, a gregarious thing by Nolan and Hoyte van Hoytema. It is designed to look the best it possibly can in whatever shape your venue offers. That's the cool thing. So if you have a theater you love, it's designed to look the best in that theater, and you will have a good time with it. And I encourage people to, you know, if you are a film freak and you want to go risk seeing it on analog, I think it's worth the risk. But if you just go, you know, you love the Dolby Cinema near you and it works great, go. It's fine. You will have a good time, I promise.
Yeah, I just went to go see a bog standard ass screening at the movie theater that's near me that I like because the seats are very comfortable. And that's it. And I had a very good time. Yeah, like I will get into. I have some specific personal quibbles with elements of the movie, but absolutely, I think it is a beautiful production. It is definitely like a movie well worth seeing in the movie theater. If there are people who are like on the fence about it at this point, listening to the podcast, like even I would still recommend people go see it because it's a good time. And it's like, it's the kind of movie that, you know, it's a Christopher Nolan movie. Like it works well in that kind of like big kind of theatrical way. And so I think it's very well worth doing. And if you're trying to be more adventurous and go to the more exotic style screenings, maybe do some research ahead of time to make sure you're going to get something that actually functions.
And again, it's supposed to be more seamless than that. It's supposed to be, and mostly I think that particularly if you're going digital, they've probably done this right. Of it's just whatever the screen there in the venue is, it's going to match. But yeah, I would not stress out about it too much unless you really want to check all your boxes. There are cool opportunities, but overall, and again, what we should really be talking about is the quality of the film. And so let's talk about that. I mean, you know, one thing I'll say, Sean, is I remember when this project was announced, it sounded like kind of an odd fit for Christopher Nolan. And I will say one thing that did surprise me is it is much more of a full-throated mythological telling of the Odyssey than I would have expected from him, in that it has magic and it has monsters, and it's this is not the Dark Knight. We're going to try to make the Cyclops is not a dude in armor that I'm just trying to think of like his Batman approach of how he would do it. It is more full-throated in that things are attributed to the gods, even if you do not necessarily see them. But I think you are supposed to believe these things are the gods' work, all of that stuff. And it is also, because I remember when I was shown this in high school and our teacher talked about how most adaptations cut out the telemachy, and most adaptations kind of redo it in chronological order. And I do think one of the strengths of Nolan's version, I think on a macro level, the structure of this movie is really good, and I like that it preserves... It's not all in the same order as Homer, obviously, and that's fine, but it does start in Ithaca, in the present day, with Telemachus going off on his mission. All of Odysseus' stories are related through flashback that are presented as him telling a story. He's telling it to Calypso in this version instead of the Phoenicians. But it is still a flashback. It basically preserves the structure of the poem, which I just remember is something that it's often been talked about, how that is something most filmmakers working with the Odyssey shy away from. But I think Nolan understands how that is a strength, because it is a story about stories to some degree. And also, Nolan totally gets that this story is about the homecoming, and it is about the impossibility of that. And I think thematically, its head is absolutely in the right place. And that's all stuff that, I really connected with in this movie, in addition to the fact that it is, as a piece of filmmaking, very intense and scary and emotional and spectacular.
Yeah, I want to come back to the kind of the magical or mystical qualities of the story, because I have more mixed feelings on that. But one thing I definitely want to praise, I think for me, as an adaptation, is the thing I kind of appreciate and enjoyed the most about the movie, is I think, a clever use of taking that broadly the structure from the Odyssey and adapting it to the film, because it's more of a kind of parallel narrative structure, which I think just works really well for the movie, right? Where it starts with Telemachus, then you go to Odysseus, who's, with Calypso, and then you just kind of get these chapters kind of back and forth where you have Odysseus relaying these series of events to Calypso, and then sometimes you take a kind of a little bit of a break from those, and then it cuts to Telemachus, who's on the next stage of his journey where he's with Menelaus or whatever, or you'll cut to Ithaca and get a little bit with the suitors and Penelope, and then you come back to Odysseus, and then you get the next kind of phase of his journey there, and then ultimately all kind of comes together with what is probably the most from scratch thing in the movie, which is this original episode of how in this version Odysseus and Telemachus meet, which is the suitors have hired some mercenaries to disguise themselves as priests, and Odysseus kind of arrives there at the same time as Telemachus gets to this temple, and that is where they intersect, and then Odysseus starts putting together his plot. But I think that structure to the movie is really, really effective. And I think it feels like they probably worked very hard to find how exactly do you tie all of these pieces together? How do you organize them in a way that is cinematic? What are the things that you kind of trim out or combine in different ways? And some of them are things that I feel like, some of this is just hard for me because I have such a long-standing relationship with the original story. There are some specific choices, like the lotus flower thing, combining that with Calypso feels a little clunky to me. I just don't know if it's necessary. I think you could have... I think there's some elements of the subtleties of the story that Nolan makes a little bit more thudding. That I think there's a little more space to not have to have the kind of he just is literally rediscovering these memories because you've done the lotus flower thing or whatever. But broadly speaking, outside of specific quibbles I have, that I think I would have preferred to done a different way. I think the logic of the structure of the movie is really, really strong, and is something that would have been a huge challenge to tackle, including things this is something that I think would be kind of expected, but is well done, where they take the Trojan horse episode and make that a much bigger kind of centerpiece of this version of the telling. Then obviously in the original story, it is alluded to. You have people talk about it, but it's not a major focus of the Odyssey, because one can presume that episode would be something detailed in some other oral story that was told by people, and did not all of these things need to be contained in the Odyssey. For our kind of public, in the broader public knowledge or popular cultural understanding of these stories, the Trojan horse is so iconic and so central that bringing that in, they bring in the character Sinon, who is from, I believe that character's from the Aeneid, the Elliot Page character, the soldier who's left behind to Aiden, the deceit of the Trojan horse, is not a character in the Odyssey, but is from other mythical tellings of the story. And so I think that kind of, here's a little bit of like a grab bag of some other Odysseus-related stories. Here's this parallel storytelling structure. We've trimmed and combined a couple of episodes together. We've created an original episode as this kind of turn point into the final act of the story. And then they have, like, I think a more palatable for modern audience version of the ending. And I think it is, outside of specific quibbles I can get into, on that maxi level, it is a really well-structured film, and one that I think is elegant in its structure in a way that, like, if you don't know the original story, you might not have any idea how much work it took to come up with this structure. Because you can't just do the Odyssey as it was in the poem. You can't just take that structure as it was. But there are elements of that structure that are so essential to what the story is that you need to have a in medias res opening. You need to have flashbacks. You need to have this nonlinear element is essential to what the Odyssey is. You just have to find a way to make it work in film, and I really think they did.
Totally, and I agree. I think on a macro, this was particularly on my second viewing, the macro structure of the thing is so rock solid, and it does what I always think of as the Godfather 2 thing, which is that it's a really long movie. Godfather 2 is about 3.5 hours, this is about 3, but it is extremely elegant in structure. And I'm always fascinated by movies that are long but elegant. And Godfather 2, you can really diagram that movie out into about 7 or 8 chapters of movement. And that is part of why the movie works so well despite its, very long length. And this Odyssey is basically like that as well. You can diagram this thing out pretty simply of sort of Telemachus chapter at the beginning of kind of all of our exposition of what the stakes are for this thing. Then you have Odysseus's first set of remembrances, the main one being the Cyclops. You have that back and forth. I actually think this is another movie where I watch and I go, it is so too bad we are not allowed to do intermissions anymore, because this movie has a perfect built-in intermission. Like, so perfect, I wonder if Nolan tried to get away with it. And even he is not powerful enough to make theaters do an intermission. But like it is when you get through the whole Hades episode, and that is when it is like so upsetting that Calypso then basically tells him, let's stop for tonight and eat more lotus and we'll stop for now. If you went to intermission there, you walked out for 15 minutes, because that is like the height of like the intensity of the movie, and then you come down, take a break, you come back, where it restarts is Telemachus and Menelaus, and then it is, it's Antinous and Penelope, and going back to that set of things, and then it is Telemachus and Menelaus, and those two scenes basically preview all the things that are going to happen in the second half of the movie. That's a great macro structure of having this build to a big moment of mid-movie resolution, and then start with kind of building back up where you preview what is the next act of the story going to be, and then we get back into Odysseus's flashbacks and whatnot. And it all dovetails really neatly in that third hour. And I agree, like, because the stuff of Telemachus getting killed, that's like, there is an incident in the book about the suitors doing that. It's changed here to be at this temple in Pylos, and Odysseus going there, and that is where, as you say, they meet up. So we have this sort of parallel narrative that converges very cleanly, and then we have the full final act that does all the stuff with the suitors and whatnot. And really, there's only a couple, like, major incidents in the book that are completely removed. It's stuff like Telemachus stops at more places. They just have him go to Menelaus, which is fine.
Nestor is cut out, which is the first place you go, which, there's no, you don't need Nestor. Sorry, old man Nestor, I like you, but you don't need to be in the movie version.
Right, and the other one is the Phoenicians and Nausicaa and all of that, which again, it's nice. I don't know really how. I think it would feel repetitive if you had him going to multiple places on his way home, because you would have, it works in the poem, but it would be, I think, too much of a nesting doll structure of stories within stories. Yeah. I think him just doing this with Calypso, letting Charlize Theron play that character, that all makes sense to me, and then they don't do the Laertes thing at the end. But other than that, it kind of hits on everything, at least a little bit, and maybe it changes it and does different things with it and combines, but most things are represented in there, and that's pretty cool. And, the other thing I will say for Nolan as a filmmaker, he's had a pretty consistent style, I would say, that began with The Dark Knight, where he makes really aggressively fast movies. I think The Dark Knight, you see this. Inception, you see this, where he makes movies that are always on, and they are going and going and going. And I run hot. And sometimes I think it can be very effective. I think The Dark Knight is very well made on this level. I think Inception I like more as a movie. I think it falls apart on The Dark Knight Rises. But he has movies like they're scored through, where either Hans Zimmer or Ludwig Göransson is just at 11 for 2.5 hours, just going, going, going. It's a lot of aggressive montage of overlaying events and whatnot. This kind of reached its apex with Oppenheimer a couple years ago, and I was of two minds of it. I think on a craft level, it is amazing. His editor now is a woman named Jennifer Lame, who is a phenomenal editor, and Oppenheimer is a real feat of editing, but I also find that movie pretty exhausting because it is basically 3 hours of uninterrupted montage editing, and that can get pretty heavy at a certain point. And while he has elements of that in the Odyssey, there is some montage editing, particularly early and at the end, with the things where he likes to overlap time and distance. Mostly he doesn't do that. This movie is much slower paced than anything he's made, I would say, other than like Interstellar in the last 20 years. And so you have stuff like the Cyclops episode or the Circe episode that are just, they're slower, they breathe. Sometimes they let the score go away, which is like as good as. And look, Ludwig Göransson is the best. The music is great. Sometimes you do need silence in your movies, and this is the first movie in a while where Nolan has had some actual silence. He really engages with. Like, most of the stuff in the flashbacks is done as horror movie. I really think, like, as a genre, he does it less as, like, epic fantasy than as fucking, like, body horror at certain points. And I really like how much this movie gets to breathe within that structure, and episodes feel like they play with a certain, I don't know if I would call the movie slow, but for Nolan it's slow. And it's stuff like that where I really feel like he looked at what he did on Oppenheimer and said, I've probably pushed that as far as I can push it. This story doesn't need it. Let's slow down. And I think as a filmmaker, he's finding new gears here that I haven't seen in him before, particularly in stuff like the Circe scene, that is just a standout in how it just lives with the horror and the emotions and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think I would generally agree with this. And if anything, maybe one of my criticisms of the movie is I wish it went more in that direction, because I also think like probably like the biggest thing that is a thing that like I just couldn't kind of fully get with the movie that is the most, it made me feel like of like, right, this is why I don't like Christopher Nolan's movies all that much, is like the tone feels too flat for most of the movie, or too kind of like dull to me. Now I do think where it gets the most interesting, I think the Circe thing is the best thing in the movie, and I honestly wish like more of the movie was like that, because it's also probably the most transformative of any individual episode in how he takes the story of like he adapts broadly most of the elements of it, but it's a very original take, and doesn't just feel like the Cyclops one, which feels like a kind of like cut down version of that episode and things like that. The Circe one is like a full kind of like living, breathing interpretation of that moment and that sequence from the story that takes it in a very different direction. I think it's very successful. It gets that horror tone, like that stuff works. But so much of the rest of the movie, like a lot of it is like, I think like the way the Calypso scenes feel, a lot of the scenes in Ithaca, there's just a certain flatness to it, or dullness, or oftentimes people use the word cold. We're talking about Nolan, which I think is kind of what I'm feeling there. To those that, like, I think if he could have a richer palette with the way that the tone in the movie expressed itself, and had even more of that space to breathe, I think it would be even better. But I think there's like the sense of like a lot of the color of the Odyssey feels like it kind of is left on the cutting room floor. There's like none of the like humor of that story is there. Obviously, none of the sensuality of the story is there. The violence, it feels toned down. There's just like that sense to me of like everything is just flattened out a bit too much. And some of that I think is just, there are some things that maybe I need to relinquish a little bit from my own kind of feelings on the original story, but some of it is also just kind of this like pervasive sense of the overhanging tone that reminds me of watching The Dark Knight and Inception and The Dark Knight Rises, that all had a similar kind of feeling to me, even if, again, I think this movie does start to break out of it in specific moments. It doesn't find like a richer texture for the whole film to express that is something more like you would find, just to give some comparisons of like modern mythological style movies that I thought did a really great job with the tone, would be something like The Green Knight or The Northman, which are like very modern films that are very mythologically coded and are very steeped in the mythology that they're either adapting or kind of inspired by, and have this sort of like this sense of tone to them that feels way richer and deeper to me than Nolan. And there's just something about his style that always feels like I just can't quite get into it because of that sense of the texture of the movie itself just keeps me out for some reason.
And I will say, this is sometimes my problem with Nolan. This is, like, word for word what you just said is one of my critiques of Oppenheimer, I think. That is, especially for a biopic about the ups and downs of a person's life, feels very flattened to me in some ways tonally. I didn't feel it here. I thought it was better. I mean, I don't want to say I didn't feel it. This is a Christopher Nolan movie. Like, through and through, you're either in for it or you're not. Like, this is Chris Nolan. No doubt about that. I do think, and maybe this is because I've seen everything he's done in between, Sean, and so I have more of a sense of it's like if you have more words for a color, you can see more colors,
right.
So I can see more gradations here, and I do think there is more tonal variance in this one. I also I do think there is a consistency to the vision of the movie, and I think it plays into his thematic into the story with sort of the centrality of the sacking of Troy and that kind of stuff that did work for me, because I think it all dovetails into a really strong thematic punch at the end. So that all worked. But yeah, I mean, this is just, again, it kind of either works for you or it doesn't. I do think there are ways this is better than some of his other stuff. But yeah, it's definitely a Chris Nolan movie. Part and parcel of that is you do just have wall-to-wall the best fucking actors doing great work. Mm-hmm. This is a movie where this is really truly a no small parts movie, because you've basically got every part in the movie played by somebody significant, and sometimes they're there for like 2 minutes, but it's like a huge actor, and they're great. Like, you've got, Lupita Nyong'o in a dual role as Helen and Clytemnestra, and they're in the movie for like 3 minutes, but it's like there's some very strong moments they get to play. Elliot Page is phenomenal in those couple of scenes as Sinon, I think. Robert Pattinson, he's fucking Batman, and he just gets to chill sitting back and being the world's biggest dick in this movie, and I fucking love that. I think, Samantha Morton steals the show as Kirke in the middle of the movie. Just fantastic.
I'm glad I've infected you with the ever-shifting pronunciation of that character's name.
Yes. And I even thought, you know what? This is the first time I've looked at Tom Holland and gone, you know what? I think that guy could be a real actor. I think Nolan got a real performance out of him. And maybe that's also because I've loved Tom Holland's journey outside of this movie, where he worked with a real filmmaker for the first time in his fucking life, and the scales have fallen from his eyes. And in every interview, he's like, Nolan, knew what he was doing, man. He came to say, he had a shot list, and he had a vision, and I called Marvel. This is literally what he said. And I'm like, we're not doing that on Spider-Man anymore. You got to have a plan, guys. And I'm just come to the light, Tom Holland. You are welcome here, and we love that you are being converted by a real filmmaker. This is why I can never dismiss Chris Nolan, because he gets people like Tom Holland on our side, and it's great.
Yeah, I mean, there is just that thing where it makes you realize that Tom Holland was sort of cursed by being cast as Spider-Man so young,
yes.
That, he didn't know anything else. That's what filmmaking was for him, because it's most of the things that he was doing for all these different Marvel movies. And it's and I'm with you, it's certainly not the most riveting performance in the movie, but he does a good job. And I think he sells the character. I think particularly when Odysseus comes back and then they have their kind of interactions, I think that whole dynamic works really well. I think him and Matt Damon have good chemistry with those kind of roles. And obviously the acting is excellent across the board.
Yeah, Matt Damon, I was a little wary of that. Although I love, and not because I dislike Matt Damon. Matt Damon, if I were to just sit here and list movies I love that Matt Damon is in, we'd be here all day. That dude has the best taste in projects, and good for him for that. I think he's really good here. I do not think it's possible for any one performance to get all the aspects of Odysseus from the poem. He's too rich a character. And I can imagine another version that gets way more of the characters, obviously humor and tricksterness and all of that. I think what Matt Damon gets is there really is a gravitas he brings to this. I'm very impressed by his physicality. When he does the stringing the bow and you see like his arms just like, he really sells that idea of this dude can do incredible things with ease. He's very good at that. I think he sells for the specific vision Nolan is getting in this story, which is kind of this haunted interiority of a man who did something unforgivable and is trying to learn to live in the world with that. I think he plays that very, very beautifully. And again, I can imagine other versions. You know, Sean Bean played Odysseus in Troy for like 5 minutes, and I think if you were to do like really go in on the Odysseus Lord of Lies thing, Sean Bean would be so good for that. Like, oh my God, he'd be great. But I really liked what Matt Damon did with it too.
Yeah, I mean, Sean Bean has that great scene at the beginning of his character's introduction where they come on and he's pretending to be some random farmhand or whatever and just like talking shit about Odysseus. Like it's a great moment. You know, because Odysseus is just he's a tricky bastard. And he loves to do that shit. Yeah, I do think obviously Matt Damon does a really good job. I had a hard time kind of accepting some of this version of Odysseus feels sanded down a bit too much to me. I think he just feels like a bit too bland of a character. And none of that is coming from Matt Damon's performance. I think it's just like it feels like they didn't want to make him, they were unlikable in any way, right? Like he doesn't have the same sort of sense of, I mean, you know, like the specific thing is like, you know, the way that they alter the Cyclops episode is really weak to me, of him just like, instead of taking and I get it, they wanted to make it so the Cyclops didn't talk or whatever. But they take the whole thing of Odysseus stops, turns back and says, I am Odysseus, sacker of Troy, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Like, I'm the dude who did this to you. And turning that into him like doing a little parting shot with the arrow because he gets mad because the Cyclops coughs up a helmet. It sort of robs a lot of the character of, to me, what is a lot of the essence of the character. And I think similarly about like, you know, I'm not surprised that they didn't do this stuff, but the lack of the sensuality of the character around his relationships with like Kirke and Calypso, you know, they gesture at it towards with Calypso, but it's a very chaste. They're holding hands on the beach. You know, it's like they're like 13-year-old kids, like 8th graders that just started dating.
Well, I'll give you this, Sean. I do think it is still a limitation for Nolan. And I will say, actually, I do think he writes women better here than he has in a while. I think there's like the Circe episode, there's some interesting stuff. And I've seen some good criticism on both sides from women writers saying they thought this was an improvement. Some thought it wasn't. But in general, I liked how he writes the women in this movie more than he has in a while. I do think he has a significant problem that he is too scared of sex. It has been a problem in his movies before. It's the thing that would mean that as much as he loves James Bond, he could never direct a James Bond movie because it is just something and look, it's fine. If it's not what you are comfortable with, you shouldn't make, I don't want to say directors need to do everything, but like, it is something I definitely felt that missing, and I do think my single biggest adaptational issue I would take with the movie is what you just said about the Cyclops. I love that whole sequence. Don't think you need to change anything else about it. I just wish at the end, instead of shooting the arrow, and I don't think you need to make it as big and flowery as it is in the poem, I think you could fit it in Nolan's general verbal style here of him just, pounding his chest and going, I sacked Troy, I did this, I did that, I beat you, while his men are pulling him away. It would only need to be a couple of sentences. I think you could keep the general style of the scene, and having him do something more aggressively egotistical would read stronger to me there. That would be my biggest asterisk on the movie by far.
Yeah, I just think that like a lot of the flaws of the character feel like they are really dramatically sanded down, which is probably like my biggest kind of issue with the movie, because I also think it kind of hurts some of the central theme stuff of this idea of like, that he, by doing the trick of the Trojan horse, he's like, there was this grand violation of Xenia, or what they call Zeus's law in the movie, and that is like this representation of the kind of like degradation of humanity, right, and of like human civilization, and this is where he ties in the whole like the peoples from the sea thing, which is also something that I just kind of groaned at. I don't know, like I just thought it was very corny that he took this sort of like what is a historical sort of question about the end of the Bronze Age, about like the fall of these civilizations, and sort of inserted it into the movie. And I guess like maybe what a lot of these things tie into is the thing I alluded to earlier, which I just have a little bit of a harder time getting behind how reduced the kind of mystical or mythological elements are in the movie. Now, he does do a lot of it, like there are big monster sequences and there are multiple of them. It's not like he's, as you said, it's not like he's trying to do the Dark Knight thing, but I think there is still too much of a sense of like trying to ground all of it too much of because I think you could also very much interpret this movie if you wanted to. I'm not saying that this is how I see it, but I mean, but I have seen people say this, that like you can see the movie of that all the monster stuff is not literally something that happened to him, but something that his emotionally fractured and drugged psyche is interpreting these terrible things that happened on the journey this way.
I don't think the form of this film supports that. I do not think that. I can understand that as an intellectual headcanon thing. That is not the movie Nolan shot. Like, the film grammar does not support that. I will be very firm on that.
I think the one thing that gives you like ammo in that direction is the use of Athena, where there is an ambiguity to it. But so you have Zendaya playing seemingly Athena, who appears to Odysseus at various points, mostly when he is drugged. And then at the end, he has that moment when he's talking to Penelope, and he's kind of trying to come to terms with, what he did with the Trojan horse. And then he looks over and sees Zendaya there, and then you get the completion of a flashback you've seen multiple times of him seeing the head of this Athena statue that has been decapitated, and this ties into the fall of the sack of Troy in a lot of the stories. The reason why Athena sends the Greeks all over the fucking place is because they sacked one of her temples when they destroyed Troy. But that he also then sees a girl that looks like Zendaya getting executed. Now, you can very much interpret the movie as saying that this Zendaya character that Odysseus has been seeing is Athena that has been coming to him in the form of this person, but it also very much is giving the movie a very strong out of saying the gods aren't real. They aren't actually present. They are things that are a figure of your mind, and that he is, this is a representation of his trauma that he has been fleeing from, and he's been constantly seeing this girl and interpreting this hallucination or whatever as him seeing Athena. And so I think the movie, it doesn't fully commit in the way that I think if it did, it would have been able to do some more with things. It would have been able to do more with the Cyclops and make the Cyclops more of like an entity or a character like Polyphemus in the poem. I think it could have had a richer sense of the tone, made Athena more of a character. Because also like the whether it's supposed to be Athena or just hallucination, whatever it is that Zendaya is playing doesn't read as Athena. It doesn't have the character of Athena. It doesn't, it register it in that way to me at all. And that's something that I think was something that was kind of a fundamental issue I had with kind of the vision of the movie that I think left a lot on the table that it could have done more with if it was willing to jump more into the deep end with the mythological tone.
Okay, so here's what I would say. The Athena thing, let me break these out. It is definitely portrayed as he is the only one seeing Athena, and you can read that either as she is literally coming to him, or it is a projection of his guilt. I think the way it squares the circle on the Zeus's Law and Xenia stuff, that he sees in Athena the body of a woman who encompasses the way he broke the law, broke this thing, that the stranger could be a god in anyone's body, that is this thing that haunts him. I think that is a very powerful way the movie squares the circle of that theme throughout the run. But that is definitely something internal to Odysseus. But I would say all the mythology stuff, like, I just don't think you can look at how the Cyclops scene is shot, or, the Scylla and Charybdis stuff, or any of that, and say this is in his head, because Nolan doesn't shoot those differently than he would shoot scenes on Ithaca or something, right? And there is still the sense that, like, there are these massive, bigger forces bearing down on these characters, and while they do not have a personal relationship with the gods in that back and forth, we're talking, we see each other, all of that stuff, they are all believing that the gods are there, and I think we can very easily read into the story that, yes, they ate the sun god's cattle, and then Poseidon sank, or Zeus sank their ship and all of that stuff, right? Like that, I think, is still there. And I think part of, for me, Sean, is I watched last week the movie Troy again, the Wolfgang Petersen movie, which we've mentioned a couple of times. And that movie is a hot fucking mess. It has parts that work pretty well. I think that thread of the movie is very good. With Eric Bana, he's very good. I think they have a pretty good read on Achilles, and I think the Hector-Achilles stuff, basically the only part where they are directly adapting the Iliad, is very good. Where it is the duel between the two of them, and then Achilles desecrating the body, and then the scene where Peter O'Toole as Priam goes. That part's very good. Everything else in that movie is a hot mess, and part of why it's a hot mess is that one goes really hard on we're treating this as a history movie, which is fucking stupid. It's a stupid way to do Greek mythology. It's a stupid way to try to treat this story. It is stupid to try to give, and this is the logical historical reason for why the Trojans would protect Helen in this. It's that whole movie reads as very stupid because of how it does it, and that movie was written by Game of Thrones writer David Benioff, so maybe that has something to do with it. But anyway, I just was watching him going, oh my god, this is the worst way to do Greek mythology, and so that contrast was just very powerful for me when I went to see the Nolan, where you could imagine a version of this that more fulsomely includes the gods in it, but it is not told in a historical register. This movie is still very firmly told in a mythological register, and Hollywood is pretty allergic to that. That's impressive to me. This is a weird, violent, off-putting movie in a lot of ways. It's a big blockbuster because it's Christopher Nolan, but if anyone else made this would be The Northman. It would be playing in art house theaters and make $20 million. And I think The Northman could have been a big blockbuster if it was sold that way. That movie fucking kicks ass. Yeah. I love that movie. But this is still in a mythological register. It is much closer to The Northman or The Green Knight than it is Troy. And I would agree that I think Robert Eggers in particular has more fluency with mythology when you look at The Northman or Nosferatu or The Witch or something like that. But I will defend Nolan here as this is not chickening out on telling the Odyssey and trying to pretend that we're giving you the natural explanation for each of these things happening.
Sure, exactly. I think it's not that it's trying to fully ground it. It's certainly not trying to do the Troy thing, which is just Although it does, amusingly to me, it does actually take one specific page from Troy's book where the way they portray Agamemnon is basically what Troy did to try to define why the Trojan War happens, which is Agamemnon is a conqueror and he's the ruler of the Greeks and has some sort of imperial figure. There's the episode of the movie in Hades where the spirit of Agamemnon appears and Odysseus and all of his men kneel to him, which is you're a king, man. You're not subservient to, I get that technically he was the leader of the Greek, the sort of composite Greek army, but you are not subservient to Agamemnon. He's on the same level. So they do, and it's similar to they have the whole thing with Menelaus and Helen, and I thought was a slightly odd thing of Menelaus has disfigured Helen as a punishment for what happened. There are these little things the movie does to feel it's trying to maybe it's my problem with this is it feels like it's trying to have its cake and eat it too. It is doing lots of things that are, and I agree. I'm not interpreting the monster things as being they're just hallucinations. They are symbolic of Odysseus's traumas and things like that, but not in such a way that they are not things that within the realm of the movie are meant to be seen as they didn't literally happen. They're just symbolic from an interpretive point of view from the Odyssey's perspective. But I do think the movie has a little bit too much of this stuff of the sea people, how they treat Agamemnon, how they treat Helen, things like removing the gods. Calypso is Calypso supposed to be a nymph? That's very ambiguous. She doesn't read to me as being mystical. Circe is
she absolutely reads as mystical. She's feeding him this stuff that makes him forget. I think she absolutely reads as mystical.
He's here's a drug. They ground it in a physical thing that he's eating that gives him, soothes his pain or whatever. It doesn't.
There's also a moment where he says, only gods, she says, you could be here forever, and he says, only gods live forever, and there's a very knowing cut to her as she looks away. That's seen as, on a filmic grammar level, very clearly implying she is more than she has revealed to him. That is absolutely there in the grammar.
But there's
the film.
A difference between here's a slightly knowing cut and here is Calypso the goddess.
So,
you know,
sure, but like some of this, Sean,
diminishes it to me.
Yeah, on the Agamemnon point, though, like, to me, that's just shorthand for an audience of, like, because you can't really introduce the complicated figure that is Agamemnon in this movie that is doing all these other things for someone who hasn't read. Like, if you go into this and you don't really know, you haven't read the Iliad, you haven't seen other versions, you don't really know who Agamemnon is, just saying, hey, he's the guy who took us to war, he's the big commander dude, that's what you kind of need to know for this. I don't think that's like a diminishment of like the mythological aspect. I think that's a shorthand for a modern audience thing.
Yeah, but I think by trying to create all these shorthands for the modern audience, it is sort of like crowding and hedging its bets in such a way that it doesn't feel like it's jumping in. Like Nolan feels like he's too restrained by something, and it's the sensuality elements, it's the not wanting Odysseus to do anything that's like too objectionable. They don't really show his men actually raiding, right? They like give a little bit of too much of a justification for like, well, you guys weren't following the rule of Zeus. It's like the fucking Xenia thing does not matter if you're trying to just murder motherfuckers and take all their stuff.
I think one of the men says that, and I found in that scene that the framing is it's bullshit when he says that, but sure.
I think there's just too many instances like that in the movie that feels like it's sanding things down and kind of boxing things in. Now, I'm not saying it makes the movie bad, but it's a thing that when I'm looking at something like The Green Knight or The Northmen that do embrace the mythological register of their source material and then also take it into a kind of a different thing, they're not, I mean, certainly The Green Knight is anything but a like strictly faithful adaptation of the original story, but it is taking that and doing something with it that I find much more rich. And it's like, this movie is good and it's entertaining, but it feels like it's got all these pieces that it could have gone even further if Christopher Nolan was able to break out of some of these things that feels like it's holding him back. And I think you see it in, again, like I think the Cersei scene where it feels like it is most embraced, partially because it just chooses totally to change the character of Cersei. There's no like knowing cut of, oh, if you know Calypso from the poem, you know that she's a nymph. It's like, that's just a different character. She's not a goddess. She's like a weird witch that lives on this island. She is killing people specifically because there are all these people, like soldiers coming home from Troy, that this is, God knows how many times she has done this. She has this like sister that she's transformed. Like, so much of the Cersei episode is totally original. It is taking the seed of the thing in the original poem of, here is this strange magical woman who lives on this island that turns people into pigs, and is sort of this fantastical exploration of the customs of hospitality of Xenia. But I feel like Nolan totally transforms it, not by shaving elements down around the edges and trying to diminish or reduce things from the original story, but by finding a totally original, different take and sprouting it and going in a different direction. I just wish more of the movie did that and found other ways to really kind of find a truly original adaptation, rather than sometimes feeling like constrained by trying to do too much from the poem while also trying to ground it too much in Nolan's style.
Yeah, I mean, so here's my read on the film. And just to be clear, I love the poem. I don't care how faithful. Like, that's not, like, and I know that's not what you're saying either. Like, yeah, that's the only metric. But, like, what I'm looking for in something like this is kind of like, how much is he taking it into his style? That's what I want to see from a notable filmmaker working with a notable text. And, the central driving theme of Nolan's filmography, and I would say it comes into focus for the first time heavily in Inception in 2010, so after The Dark Knight, and it is then the driving theme of every movie he makes after that point, is this theme of men who are obsessed with their work or lost in their work in some way, who are trying to get home and for some reason or another cannot. And I think at times that has been portrayed beautifully. I think Interstellar is his other best movie for this reason. That is a stunning, I think, rendering of that theme. I think Inception is a good rendering of that theme. I think The Dark Knight Rises is the clunkiest possible rendering of that theme because it's trying to mix with Batman in ways that just don't fucking work even a little bit. And so you get the terrible ending of The Dark Knight Rises and all of that stuff. But it's there. It's still been there in Dunkirk, and it's been there in Tenet, and it's been there particularly in Oppenheimer. And in Oppenheimer, he elevates this to an even sort of higher social register where it is not just about men obsessed with work trying to get back to their families and being pulled in some other direction by some kind of guilt or duty, but also that guilt or duty is in some way damning the world around them, and it is the thing that will prevent them from ever being able to embrace that thing again. And I think it's really interesting, particularly watching this after Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is the movie where he finally won all his Oscars and all of that stuff, and it was a big hit, and Oppenheimer's a really interesting film, if nothing else. I'm always fascinated that movie grossed $1 billion because it is this, talky biopic with this, like, aggressive montage style, and it became this phenomenon, which is so weird in so many ways. But the Odyssey is so clearly a progression of the themes from Oppenheimer, just viewed instead of through recent American history, relatively recent American history, last century, through, this ancient story. And the fact that he sees, his themes in Odysseus is obvious, that Odysseus is the archetypal Nolan hero in that sense, of the person who wanders in their work and is unable to get home. That's obvious. I think the connection, and I do think this is the big thing that, he throws into the story that I think makes this adaptation sing, and I think justifies a lot of the other decisions, is the choice to center the sack of Troy. This was also something that was on my mind because of watching the movie Troy. The Wolfgang Petersen movie, it does the sacking of Troy, and it does it incredibly graphically. It shows women being raped and babies being killed and all the horrible things that would have happened. But then it has nothing to say about it. It happens. Achilles gets killed. Odysseus, Sean Bean, has a little speech, and then the movie ends, and it's like, it winds up feeling like, in the same way some of David Benioff's Game of Thrones writing does, this very sadistic, just like, here's this sadistic thing that happened, and we have nothing to say about it. And I think it's really interesting that, and I almost wonder if this is conscious on Nolan's part, because he was actually attached to direct Troy before he then left to do Batman Begins. Him and Wolfgang Petersen swapped places, because Petersen was doing a Batman v Superman movie, gets canceled, Nolan gets hired to do a Batman movie, Wolfgang Petersen took over on Troy. And so that question of the sacking of Troy, which, while you don't see it directly in the Odyssey, is ever present. I mean, one of his epithets is city sacker. And he always brags about sacking the city of Troy and that sort of thing. And I think taking that and making it this sort of central thematic evolving gesture of the movie, and it's specifically in the macro structure of the movie, it comes up 3 times. The very beginning is we see the Trojan horse and it being pulled into the city. In the middle of the movie with Menelaus, you get the story of what it was like from the inside of the horse. And then you ultimately get Odysseus' perspective on it, which is what happened after they exited the horse. And the idea that this thing was so evil and unleashed something so bad that the world cannot be put back together again, which is also one of the central themes of Oppenheimer, with the bomb going off and building to the ending where Oppenheimer says to Einstein, remember when we thought we might destroy the world? I think we actually did. And this movie winds up having a more positive ending on that, because it sees some kind of, redemptive future in that, leaving home and going on and trying to hope that the next generation does it better. But I found all of that very moving. I'm very in our present day with the amount of just evil in the world and on behalf of our leaders and all of that stuff. I am really drawn to stories of mortality and grappling with the evil that is done and how we live with it. And I think the choice to see the Odyssey, I think very clearly, this is I think the most topical, in a weird way, movie. No, this is the most I feel like Nolan's ever commented on contemporary politics is in this movie. And I think the choice to do that and wrap the story up in that, I think it's such a strong thematic rendering of the text for these purposes within the broader kind of auteur project, that I was really floored by it by the end, in a way that again, like I said, some Nolan movies leave me cold, and this one did not.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything you just said. I think on a macro level, the movie fundamentally works, and I think that thematic point and this sort of pseudo original sin of the Trojan horse, that stuff all functions well for me. I think it's the micro details of where I intellectually saw, okay, this is what the movie's doing, and it's well structured, it's doing all of this. But there's again, other than the Cersei section, which really kind of drew me in, The rest of it, I just felt like there was a certain, like, it's that intimacy or that sensuality. There's something there that is like lacking, that makes me feel like I'm skipping along the emotions and the themes of what the movie's trying to present without being able to kind of like dive into them and be kind of like submerged in them. Which I think in particular with mythology is so much of what it is. It's like this kind of complete world that you are inhabiting, that is this world of fantasy and magic and mysticism that pervades everything. It's not like the magic doesn't stop at this doorstep and then now we're in like the regular world. It is that like it's everything that's here. And I think that like it's on the micro level that this movie, it's not that it loses me, but that it feels like there's just more richness it could have mined, if it had found, I think, a kind of deeper way to invest and a more holistic way to invest in the mythological framing of the story, rather than hedging its bets on a lot of these moments.
Yeah, and I think for me, part of it is felt in, I really do think if I had to like assign a generic label to this movie, and I'm not the only one saying this, I've seen other critics say this, I would call this a horror movie. Like, this is the closest Nolan has come to doing that, and like, obviously it has all these elements of epic, historical fantasy and all this stuff too, but particularly in how Odysseus' journey is rendered. And I think the way it all, particularly when you watch this movie a second time, and you start to see how it is threading for the reveals of the final hour, and there are certain moments that are doing it more subtly than others, it really does feel like it is this horror movie of living in the mindset of someone who has done this thing and is suffering for it, and how you go about the process of coming home when home is no longer kind of possible. And I think it's very poignant on that level. And it is also where I think Nolan is doing just new and different things as a director, and doing sequences that definitely there's no sensuality in the sense of sexuality of the body in that way. There is like very embodied sequences where I think you feel the weight of being there and of experiencing these things. And there's scenes that just have really inventive imagery, like what are they called? The
Lastrygonians.
Lastrygonians, the like giants in armor that they meet, which is such a horrifying scene, the way that is done, and the way the woods literally close in around them. Like, I think when I think of like the way horror uses metaphor, I think that's kind of how this movie is using the metaphor of the mythology in a lot of places, and I find that very interesting and well rendered. But I also, again, I understand what you're saying, Sean, and because also like, I know, again, like I said, you have a deeper attachment to this text than me, and there is just a certain, I know there are definitely movies I've seen that are probably, I can definitely admit to being like good on a certain level, but I have attachment to the thing in a certain way, and so I just view it differently. And so I'm not saying anything you're saying is invalid for that reason. I totally get that.
Yeah, no, and I think absolutely, I think like, obviously everybody's loving this movie. Like, I totally get that, like, I think it is like, again, I think the fundamental kind of theme and the fundamental structure of the movie works really well. It's just, for me personally, and my personal interest in these kinds of things, it doesn't quite hit those notes. And it is, for me, kind of like emphasized by the fact that there have been a couple of relatively recent movies, like The Northman, that have found a really interesting, different way to do mythology. Because obviously you have the like old school Hollywood sword and sandals stuff, which I also love, like Jason the Argonauts. You can't ever go back to those days. And certainly Christopher Nolan's not going to make a movie like that. That's like for its own time. But I think there's like there are like some pretty interesting ways that one can find ways to explore this kind of mythological tone. And there are just these moments in this movie, and I keep on coming back to the Cersei one because I do just think it's like the best thing in the movie, that it feels like he's getting there, but it just doesn't quite suffuse the whole film to me.
Yeah. But Robert Eggers that dude is a one of one. Did you get the trailer for his new werewolf movie with your screening?
No, I've seen it, but okay. It wasn't at my screening.
Yeah. Robert Eggers is just making movies for you, Sean.
Yes.
He's sitting down and going, what movie would Sean Chapman of Houston, Texas like to see next? And he's just going down the list. It's crazy. I feel so happy for you, and I love them too, so it's good for me too.
I mean, it is basically like, you know, the thing that, like, the way that people talk about Christopher Nolan, where it's like he's like the greatest director ever, and every time a Christopher Nolan movie comes out, I gotta like get my like ticket and all this, you know, people get fucking like, he's got like, there's a cult around him, which is very weird. I get, you know, people really like his movies, but that is absolutely like, I mean, I don't go to the movie theaters for them because I hardly ever go to the movie theater. But for Robert Eggers movies, I've seen all of them. I just wait like a year and then get them on Blu-ray and then watch them that way. But it is just like, yes, this is the fucking shit. This is the best shit going around.
But Robert Eggers also makes much weirder,
Yes.
scalier movies, I would say, more prickly movies that I understand why his movies aren't making $1 billion. Although, to be perfectly clear, I wish we lived in that world. That would be
Yes.
an awesome world to inhabit.
Can you imagine The Lighthouse making $1 billion? Like, holy shit, what a world that would be. Oh my God.
I know. But there is also something to be said for, and this is where, like, I've always respected Nolan, even when I don't personally connect with the movies, is, you know, having a filmmaker who is a serious filmmaker, who makes, on a technical level, rock solid, and has real ideas is exploring, and relative to other commercial filmmakers, not relative necessarily to Robert Eggers, but relative to, like, most of what's in theaters now, Nolan's movies are prickly and dark and weird, and, like, you know, the Odyssey, I've seen everything else in theaters this summer, this is a much darker, weirder movie than anything else playing in theaters this summer. And to have someone who can do that and connect with a big mainstream audience, that is a skill, and that is something I would recognize in a Alfred Hitchcock or a Steven Spielberg or other kind of historical analogs to Nolan. To be clear, I would put those directors above Nolan if I'm making my tier list, but that is definitely the tradition he exists in, and thank God we have one of those, because it keeps cinema alive for everyone else, you know?
Yeah. And I think that is also probably a good piece of context for, like, my reaction to the movie. Is also, I just don't go see modern movies. You know, I only watch movies that I'm really interested in, which is mostly older movies. So it's like, for me, my point of comparison isn't like what else is going to be in the movie theater this year, but it is like what's something I saw like 5 years ago. You know, this is just my relationship to this stuff's a little bit different.
And, you know, I do think I do think to me it's frustrating that every time Nolan makes a movie, he basically hands on a silver platter Hollywood this game plan of, like, here's how to make successful original movies, right? And they just kind of keep ignoring him, and they like, well, the answer is just to pay Christopher Nolan to make them, right? And it's like, no, you guys can do this with everyone else if you want. But he does clearly has had an impact. You know, I think, like, I don't think the Dune movies or Denis Villeneuve's career exists without Chris Nolan kind of breaking down some of those barriers. I think audience tastes have, like, it's notable to me that not only has Christopher Nolan outlived the superhero boom that he is substantially responsible for popularizing, but his movies are now more popular than they were for Batman. The Odyssey is his biggest film debut worldwide ever. It's bigger than The Dark Knight Rises. Like, he has gotten bigger without IP than he was with it. And that's very good for this industry, and I think other things are coming with him. Like, you know, did you see the Avengers Doomsday trailer that came out this morning, Sean?
Oh, it looks terrible. It
looks terrible.
It's so bad. That trailer is awful.
It's awful. And I saw so many people on Blue Sky today commenting on it and going, like, especially after going to see the Odyssey, this looks awful, right? After seeing this movie shot on IMAX with beautiful locations around the world and amazing practical effects, you know, after seeing that fucking Cyclops thing, Dr. Doom looks extra stupid, right? And it's like, I do think audiences are in that mode. I think that Avengers movie is going to get its clock fucking cleaned by Dune Part 3, because Dune Part 3 is in the Chris Nolan camp of movies people actually want to see, right? Not franchise shit shoved down there. And I know Dune is a franchise technically, but it's a different kind of thing,
you know,
obviously.
And to be fair, the Odyssey's that's the oldest IP of them all. You know, he's still working on IPs. He's just leveled up a lot.
Yeah, I the same way you bristled at me using the word fiction, I do bristle at the word IP for Greek mythology, for sure.
You know, it's just it's the original cinematic universe, baby. Is fucking Odysseus going down and being like, hey, there's Heracles. Remember he did that thing with Cerberus? And oh man, there's fucking Sisyphus with his boulder again. Man, this is great. I can't wait to go see the Sisyphus movie in theaters next year. Tantalus will return.
Yes. A couple other things I want to praise from this movie. Since you just mentioned it, I thought the Hades scene was great. That is one of the coolest scenes in the book. I love how they did it. Elliot Page, so good in that. they were so good, obviously, way back when in Inception. I would love to see them keep, Chris Nolan needs to do more with Elliot Page. A really great actor who hasn't been in enough stuff recently. Loved him here. The Ludwig Göransson score, oh my God, it's so good. It's because he's using no modern instruments in it. It's got these amazing booming moments, but also the fucking sickest thing in this movie is how Göransson builds this little twanging note up so that when Odysseus does the twang on the bow, it finishes the melody diegetically. That is the coolest way, I think, to illustrate that, because it's in the poem. Obviously the twanging of the bow is a huge image in the poem, and I just love how it's done here, the strumming of it with the score. That is the coolest fucking thing.
Yes, that's very good. Nolan does a good job of, he very deliberately sets up all the things that are going to be in the ending in the first 30 minutes of the movie, which is all obviously stuff that's not really in the poem, but they bring up the bow and all that kind of stuff early on in the thing of him plucking it, which is good. One thing that is I think basically everything about the production is more or less immaculate. There is one thing that kind of cracked me up a little bit as someone who hasn't seen a Nolan movie in a long time. I'm like, he still can't quite do it, which is the action climax at the end, the fighting and the way he shoots the fighting. It's just like, man, this guy, I think it's probably a little bit better than what he's doing Batman, but it still is kind of illegible in terms of showing these people fighting. I had a pretty hard time with that.
It could also depend. I will say when I saw it on 70, mostly it was fine. How they were projecting, it was a little too dark there. When I saw it on Dolby Vision, I didn't have that problem because the blacks were so deep. So it could also be, and you could argue he should have accounted for this, whatever. But I didn't have that problem when I saw it in a really optimal viewing experience. And I will say Nolan has definitively gotten better at that. This movie aside, if you watch Tenet has some of the most amazing action choreography I've ever seen because he's doing it all backwards and forwards at the same time. So he's gotten much, much better at that side of things than he was in the Batman days. But I felt that a little bit my first viewing, just not the second.
Yeah, I think there's just something about the sort of the shaky, it's not like fucking Paul Greengrass, but the relative shakiness of the camera and the more rapid cutting. I was like, it certainly felt like he has not kept up with the modern trends in action filmmaking, which has really kind of moved on from a lot of that style, I feel.
The camera isn't shaking, but it's definitely cutting quick. I don't think you can shake an IMAX camera, but I'll give you one. Here's one that I'll give you, Sean. Nolan is the last, and to his credit, he is the last person on earth who will do a showy oneer. He is never going to do one of those bullshit 10-minute, just those oneers that annoy us that are there to show off. He does not do that. Once in a while, I do wish he would do a smaller oneer, like a Spielbergian oneer.
Yes.
Because the one I noticed in this film is Antinous in that final fight is in his own frame, and they're always cutting back to him. There needed to be a master shot somewhere of Odysseus, do a 360 of him shooting so you see the whole space. I don't need it for the whole scene. I don't need the entire slaughter in one shot. That would be bullshit and that would suck. But I wish there was one basic Spielberg style 30-second to a minute oneer that just showed you the whole geography of the space. I wouldn't need anything else different. That's the one I would say. And Nolan just does not, to his core, does not shoot like that, and that's fine. For the most part, I think it is to his credit. That is one where I think if you had one master shot there, it would help.
Yeah, I think that's some of it. It feels overly disorienting. It feels like there's a lack of a sense of clear choreography, the geography of the space. I mean, some of what they do with the geography, I thought it was an interesting choice of the storeroom is a level above them and they're throwing the weapons down. That I thought was a clever piece of staging, because that is, I keep on going back to this, the massive post note in the Robert Fitzgerald adaptation. There's a huge section where he's diagramming how the fuck is this space supposed to work? And it's if you try to actually break down the logic of it, it gets very confusing. I thought some of that was fine, but it's just in the kind of the micro details of the fight I felt just got very disorienting, and it goes on for long enough that I was he really needed to find a way to make, if you wanted the scene to be this long, to make this a more legible fight scene that had a better sense of pace to it.
Yeah, no, I get that. I want to again just praise Robert Pattinson. I love I love that Robert Pattinson is a true blue movie star. He is fucking Batman. He's in the lead in all these things. I love that he just is here and he is living his best life slumming it as the shittiest suitor. That is a part of this they fucking nailed, right? I mean,
yes.
Good God, he's great.
He's an absolute piece of shit. In fact, they arguably enhance it because they do that one. It's basically the original scene for the movie where he goes up to Penelope's chamber and talks to her one-on-one, and it's shot like from behind the loom, which I thought was cool. And I thought that was also a good adaptational choice, is just making the loom thing that Penelope is doing, which is very iconic of her weaving this death shroud for Laertes, and then she unweaves it every night. In the original action of the poem, that is a thing that has already happened, and they have already discovered that she was doing it, and instead they just move it to be a present-day thing she's doing, which I thought was a good cinematic adaptation. And then they use that to do this one scene to make you really feel like, God, this is the skeeviest motherfucker in all of Ithaca.
Yeah. I am continually disappointed that the Batman Part 2 keeps getting delayed. It is now a 2028 movie. We'll see it eventually. No, it is 2020. It's a February 2028 movie now. They are shooting it, though. But the upside of that is Robert Pattinson has been in 20 movies since the Batman, and he's great in all of them, and he's just living his best life. Because, hey, he can go be a movie star in Batman. He's fine. He can go do Mickey 17 and the Odyssey, and he's also going to be the bad guy in Dune 3. That's going to be great. I love him, and it's awesome.
Yeah, and then eventually they will make that Batman movie. It just feels like it's just always like they're getting ready to do this. Like, what? It's been fucking years.
They are filming it. They are. We can say definitively cameras have rolled on that movie. It is being filmed. I think they pushed it back more because it was going to be coming out just 2 months after Superman 2, and I don't know if they wanted Superman and Batman to be that close together, for the fiscal year kind of thing. But anyway, so it is at least getting made. But in the meantime, we've had lots of other good RPATs to enjoy. Sean, anything else we want to say about the Odyssey here?
Yeah, it's a pretty good movie.